For millennia, fragments of human history have endured, preserving questions no surviving record can fully resolve. On the open grasslands west of Okotoks, Alberta, an immense block of pale quartzite rises from the prairie like a fragment of the Rocky Mountains placed where it does not seem to belong. Known as the Okotoks Erratic, or simply Big Rock, it measures roughly 41 meters long, 18 meters wide, and 9 meters high, with an estimated mass of 16,500 tons. Its presence is immediately arresting. Surrounded by rolling prairie, the enormous stone appears almost isolated from the mountain landscape that ultimately gave it birth. Yet its position is not the result of human construction, nor does it require an extraordinary explanation. Geological evidence provides a compelling account. The Okotoks Erratic belongs to the foothills Erratic Train, a long trail of enormous quartzite boulders extending along the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains and into Montana. These rocks originated much farther west, with the quartzite of Big Rock believed to have come from the Jasper region. During the closing stages of the last ice age, immense forces of ice transported these fragments hundreds of kilometers before depositing them across the landscape. The numbers alone are difficult to comprehend. A stone weighing approximately 16,500 tons was carried nearly 400 kilometers from its geological source, not by roads, machinery, or organized labor, but through a landscape dominated by glaciers. The process unfolded roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, as the climate shifted from the Pleistocene toward the Holocene. The geological story becomes even more remarkable when the origin of the erratic train is examined. Researchers associate these quartzite blocks with a massive prehistoric landslide in the Athabasca River Valley. The fallen rocks came to rest on or within glacial ice. As the ice moved eastward, it encountered the Laurentide ice sheet which covered much of Canada. The interaction redirected the ice and its enormous cargo southward, parallel to the Rocky Mountains. As the climate warmed and the ice retreated, the stones were gradually released onto the prairie. In this sense, Big Rock is not merely an isolated boulder. It is part of a geological trail stretching across hundreds of kilometers, a physical record of climatic transformation on a continental scale. Its surface preserves the consequences of processes that began long before written history, long before permanent settlements in the region, and long before anyone could have recorded the journey with words. But geology is only one layer of the story. For the indigenous peoples of southern Alberta, the rock carries cultural meaning that cannot be reduced to its mineral composition or glacial history. The site lies within Treaty 7 territory and has particular associations with the Blackfoot Confederacy, as well as significance for other First Nations of the region. Among the Blackfoot traditions connected with the stone is the story of Napi, often described as a creator figure and trickster. According to the traditional account, Napi became tired while traveling on a hot day and rested on a rock, offering his robe as payment. When the weather changed and rain arrived, he attempted to reclaim the robe. The rock then pursued him. Napi called upon several animals for assistance, but it was the nighthawks that finally stopped the stone, splitting it in two. The story provides a cultural explanation for both the rock's location and its distinctive division. It is important to distinguish this tradition from the geological explanation. One belongs to a cultural framework that conveys values, relationships, and meaning. The other describes physical processes reconstructed through geology. They do not need to compete for the same kind of truth. And there is another layer that complicates the site further. On the southern face of Big Rock are several panels containing red ochre pictographs. Some consist of geometric forms, finger marks, and handprints. Others appear to contain shapes that have been interpreted as possible human figures, animal tracks, or repeated groups of marks. Their precise age is uncertain, and their meanings cannot be established with confidence. That uncertainty is where the archaeological intrigue begins. The pictographs are genuine physical traces of human activity, but the intentions behind them remain difficult to reconstruct. Were they associated with ceremonies? Did they commemorate particular events? Were some of the markings symbolic representations of animals or people? Could different panels have been created during separate periods, giving the rock a history of repeated cultural use? There is no single answer supported by sufficient evidence. Traditional interpretations connected with the Tsu-T'ina First Nation have associated some of the imagery with ceremonial events and even meteor impacts. Archaeological interpretations, meanwhile, remain cautious because the abstract forms are difficult to date and classify with certainty. This distinction matters. Archaeology often works with fragments rather than complete narratives. A mark survives, but the person who made it does not. Pigment remains visible, but the spoken explanation that once accompanied it is absent. A geometric symbol can be measured, photographed, compared, and mapped, yet its original significance may remain inaccessible. Even the first written documentation of Big Rock reflects the limitations of observation. During the Palliser expedition in 1857, explorer James Hector recorded the enormous stone but incorrectly identified it as a granite boulder. Modern geological analysis recognizes it instead as quartzite, and that difference became an important clue to its distant origin. Today, technology is adding another dimension to the investigation. Researchers have used terrestrial laser scanning and aerial photogrammetry to create detailed digital records of the erratic, allowing changes to its surface and surrounding environment to be monitored over time. Surveys conducted in 2013 and 2016 provided data sets that could be compared to identify physical changes. The irony is striking. A stone, transported by glaciers over hundreds of kilometers, is now being measured with technologies capable of recording millimeter-scale changes. Human beings who once encountered Big Rock as an imposing landmark could only observe it directly. Modern researchers can construct a digital representation and monitor its condition across years. Yet, technology has not solved every question. The age and meaning of the pictographs remain uncertain. The exact circumstances surrounding their creation cannot be reconstructed with confidence. Their relationship to one another, to the rock itself, and to the cultural traditions associated with the site continues to invite careful interpretation. Perhaps that is what makes Big Rock so compelling. Its largest mystery is not how a 16,500-ton quartzite mass reached the Alberta prairie. Glacial geology provides a powerful explanation. The deeper uncertainty lies in what happened after people encountered it. For thousands of years, this immense stone has stood as a landmark, geological survivor, and cultural place. Ice explains its journey from the mountains. Archaeology records traces left upon its surface. Indigenous traditions preserve meanings that geological measurements cannot capture. But between those pieces lies an incomplete human story. And as the red ochre marks weather, as visitors continue to climb the stone, and as researchers work to preserve what remains, an enduring question stays with the site. How much of the meaning, once attached to this extraordinary landmark, can still be recovered from the evidence that survives today? Beyond the immense glacial stone of Alberta, our journey now moves thousands of kilometers east, into the rugged highlands of eastern Anatolia, where another landscape preserves a very different kind of archaeological enigma. On a steep ridge overlooking the Gurpinar Plain stands Çavuştepe, the remains of a fortified settlement built during the height of the kingdom of Urartu in the 8th century BC. The setting is striking. Brown slopes rise toward distant mountains, while the ruins follow the contours of the ridge in long, weathered lines of volcanic stone. From this elevated position, the surrounding plain stretches outward beneath an immense sky. The location was not chosen casually. From here, movement through the valley could be observed, while the elevation offered a natural advantage for defense. Yet Çavuştepe was more than a fortress. During the reign of Sarduri II, around the middle of the 8th century BC, the site became an important Urartian stronghold. The kingdom itself had emerged in the highlands surrounding Lake Van and developed a sophisticated system of fortresses, irrigation works, roads, agricultural installations, and administrative centers. Çavuştepe formed part of that larger network. Its architecture reveals a society capable of organizing enormous quantities of labor. Massive stone walls once enclosed different sections of the settlement. Foundations, gateways, storage areas, temples, and administrative structures were arranged across the ridge. Some stones were carefully fitted, while other sections relied on substantial masonry foundations supporting walls that have long since disappeared. The scale of the construction raises an immediate question, not because the builders lacked known techniques, but because of the logistical demands involved. How were stone, timber, food, and labor coordinated across a mountainous landscape? How was such a complex maintained year after year? Urartian inscriptions provide part of the answer. Cuneiform texts carved into stone record royal achievements, construction projects, military campaigns, and religious dedications. At Çavuştepe, inscriptions associated with Sarduri II identify the ruler and describe his building activities. These texts transform the site from a collection of ruins into something closer to a documented historical landscape. The stones themselves speak. One of the most important features is the temple dedicated to Haldi, the chief deity of the Urartian kingdom. Religious architecture occupied a central position within Urartian political life, and the presence of the temple demonstrates that Çavuştepe was not simply a military installation. It was a place where authority, religion, administration, and defense converged. Nearby, archaeologists uncovered extensive storage facilities. Large pithoi, enormous ceramic vessels, were used to hold agricultural products, probably including grain, wine, and other provisions. Their presence reveals the practical foundation of the settlement. A fortress could not survive through stone walls alone. It required food, water, workers, animals, and an organized system of supply. The deeper mystery begins when we consider how precisely these systems were integrated. The Urartians were renowned for irrigation. Their rulers constructed canals and reservoirs across the region, transforming difficult terrain into productive agricultural zones. Some channels extended for many kilometers, carrying water toward cultivated land and settlements. Çavuştepe therefore belonged to a wider landscape of engineered resources. From the ridge, the relationship between fortress and plain becomes easier to understand. The settlement dominated the surrounding territory while agriculture below helped sustain the population above. Water management, food storage, military protection, and royal administration formed parts of one interconnected system. And yet, the surviving evidence is incomplete. The Urartian kingdom eventually disappeared as a political power, and the written record becomes increasingly fragmented. Later populations occupied or passed through the region, leaving their own traces. Over centuries, walls collapsed, roofs disappeared, inscriptions weathered, and structures were partially buried beneath accumulated soil. What happened to the people who lived here? Archaeology can identify buildings, pottery, tools, inscriptions, and changes in occupation. It can reconstruct economic systems and approximate historical sequences. But ordinary human experiences are harder to recover. The soldier standing at the gateway, the worker carrying grain into a storage chamber, the priest entering the temple. the administrator recording supplies, the family living within or near the fortress. These individuals left remarkably little written testimony about themselves. This absence has encouraged more speculative interpretations of Çavuştepe and other Urartian sites. Some theories portray the kingdom as possessing knowledge or engineering capabilities far beyond what should be expected from an Iron Age society. Such claims often point toward the monumental masonry, extensive irrigation, or carefully planned fortifications. But there is no need to invoke unknown technologies to appreciate the achievement. The Urartians were accomplished engineers working within a long regional tradition of stone construction, irrigation, metallurgy, agriculture, and state organization. Their accomplishments become more impressive, not less, when understood within the technological possibilities of their era. Still, certain questions remain. Why did the Urartians invest so heavily in fortified centers across such difficult terrain? Was the constant emphasis on defensive architecture primarily a response to warfare, competition over resources, political control, or all three? And what did Çavuştepe represent to the people who built it? A frontier stronghold, a royal statement, a sacred center, a symbol of centralized authority. Perhaps it was all of these at once. The temple provides another layer of uncertainty. Religious buildings can reveal rituals through architecture and objects, but beliefs themselves are much harder to reconstruct. We know the name of Haldi. We know that offerings and royal dedications were made in his honor. We know that Urartian kings associated their authority with divine favor. But what did worship feel like to an ordinary person standing inside that temple nearly 2,800 years ago? The silence of the ruins offers no direct answer. One of the most fascinating discoveries at Çavuştepe came not from a monumental wall, but from a much more personal object. A small inscription associated with a person known as a eunuch, identified in archaeological reporting as a palace official. The discovery has contributed to discussions about the organization of Urartian society and the people who served within royal institutions. Such evidence reminds us that the fortress was not an abstract machine of stone. People lived and worked here. They had positions, responsibilities, relationships, and identities that extended far beyond the names of kings carved into monumental inscriptions. Then there is the question of Çavuştepe's final centuries. The Urartian kingdom faced increasing pressure from neighboring powers, including the Assyrians and other regional groups. By the late 7th century BC, the political structure that had sustained Urartian rule had weakened and eventually collapsed. The exact sequence of events remains debated, and the transformation was probably not the result of a single dramatic episode. Empires rarely disappear in a single moment. They fragment through military pressure, political instability, economic disruption, changing alliances, environmental stress, and the gradual loss of centralized control. At Çavuştepe, the archaeological record preserves fragments of that transition, but not a complete narrative. This is where the site becomes particularly compelling. The walls remain. The inscriptions remain. The storage vessels remain. The temple foundations remain. Yet the political world that created them is gone. Standing on the ridge today, it is possible to trace the outlines of rooms and defensive walls while looking across a landscape that has changed many times since the Urartian period. The mountains remain familiar, but the political boundaries, settlements, roads, fields, and human communities have repeatedly shifted. Çavuştepe therefore leaves us with two very different kinds of evidence. One is solid and measurable: stone dimensions, inscriptions, pottery, architectural plans, irrigation systems, and archaeological layers. The other is the space between those facts, the intentions, fears, beliefs, and decisions that cannot be directly recovered. Perhaps that is where the enduring puzzle lies. The Urartians clearly possess the knowledge required to construct Çavuştepe. The archaeological record gives us substantial evidence for how they organized the settlement and maintained it. Yet, the complete story of why this particular place mattered, how its inhabitants experienced their world, and precisely how the site passed from a functioning center into a surviving ruin, remains incomplete. And as the wind moves through the weathered stones of the ridge, the inscriptions still preserve the names of rulers who believed their works would endure. They were right about the stones, but the meaning of the lives lived among them is harder to recover. How much of Çavuştepe's story has already been reconstructed, and how much remains in the layers that archaeology has not yet fully read? From the windswept ridge of Çavuştepe, our journey now turns toward the Pacific coast of Peru, where the landscape changes from rugged mountains to a broad coastal plain. Near the modern city of Lima, low earthen mounds rise from the desert, their surfaces softened by centuries of wind and erosion. This is El Paraíso, one of the oldest monumental ceremonial complexes on the central Peruvian coast. At first glance, the site can appear almost understated. There are no towering stone pyramids dominating the horizon, no elaborate facades covered in inscriptions, and no single monument that immediately reveals the scale of the settlement. Instead, El Paraíso spreads across the landscape through massive architectural platforms and carefully planned structures, built largely from stone and earth. Yet, these quiet remains preserve evidence of a society that organized monumental construction thousands of years before the better-known civilizations of the Andes. El Paraíso dates primarily to the late Preceramic period, roughly between 3500 and 1800 BC, although the chronology and interpretation of individual structures continue to be studied. The site belongs to a period when communities along the Peruvian coast were developing increasingly complex forms of social organization, while relying heavily on fishing, gathering, agriculture, and exchange. This immediately makes El Paraíso significant. Monumental architecture is often associated with later Andean states, but here it appears at a much earlier stage. Large structures required planning, labor, food supplies, and coordination. Even without written records, the architecture itself provides evidence of collective organization. So, who built it? And why was so much effort invested in constructing enormous ceremonial spaces in an environment that could appear so inhospitable? The surrounding landscape offers an important clue. The central Peruvian coast is one of the driest regions on Earth, yet rivers descending from the Andes create narrow, fertile valleys. Communities could exploit marine resources along the Pacific while cultivating crops inland. This combination of ocean and valley environments provided an unusual economic foundation. El Paraíso occupied a strategic position within this broader landscape. Archaeologists have identified several major architectural units, including large rectangular structures and monumental complexes arranged across the site. Some buildings contain sunken circular courts or ceremonial spaces, while others feature elevated platforms and enclosed rooms. The architecture does not resemble the classic stepped pyramids that later became famous elsewhere in the Andes. Instead, El Paraíso presents a more restrained form of monumental design. Large volumes of earth and stone were transformed into platforms and enclosures, creating spaces where groups could gather, conduct rituals, store resources, or perform activities whose exact nature is not always clear. One of the most important discoveries at the site has been evidence of organized construction using stone and mortar techniques. Some walls were built with stone blocks placed within a framework, while other structures incorporated carefully prepared surfaces. The scale suggests deliberate planning, but scale alone does not reveal purpose. A monumental building might have served religious, political, economic, or communal functions. In a society without surviving written records, archaeologists must reconstruct those possibilities from architecture, artifacts, spatial arrangements, food remains, and traces of activity. This is where El Paraíso becomes particularly intriguing. The site contains evidence that ceremonial activities took place there, but researchers continue to debate the precise social organization behind the complex. Was authority concentrated in the hands of a small elite? Were large groups brought together periodically for communal rituals? Did religious gatherings help organize labor and exchange? There may have been no single answer. Different buildings could have served different communities or purposes, changing over generations. The phrase hidden pyramids can therefore be misleading if it suggests conventional Egyptian-style pyramids concealed beneath the desert. El Paraíso is better understood as a monumental complex of platforms and architectural structures whose forms were adapted to local conditions and traditions. Yet, the comparison is still useful for one reason. Like the pyramids of Egypt and the monumental centers of other early societies, El Paraíso demonstrates that large-scale construction emerged from complex social decisions. Thousands of years before modern engineering, people were already solving problems of transportation, architecture, food production, labor organization, and environmental adaptation, and they were doing it without written blueprints. One of the more unusual features associated with El Paraíso is its relationship to nearby, coastal and riverine environments. The builders did not isolate themselves from the landscape. Their settlement appears to have been integrated into a network of resources extending from the ocean toward the foothills of the Andes. Could this ecological diversity have helped make monumental construction possible? Quite possibly. Marine resources could provide protein and other necessities, while agricultural production in nearby valleys supplied additional food. Such an economic foundation may have supported populations large enough to participate in major construction projects. But another question remains. How did these communities persuade people to devote enormous amounts of time and energy to architecture? Some researchers have emphasized cooperation and communal labor rather than coercive state power. Others have explored the possibility that emerging social hierarchies played an important role. The evidence does not yet permit a simple answer. This uncertainty has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Because El Paraíso predates many of the better-known monumental cultures of the Andes, some writers have portrayed it as evidence of an unexpectedly sophisticated civilization appearing almost without precedent. Others have suggested that the site may represent a missing stage in the development of complex Andean society. The more cautious archaeological interpretation is less dramatic, but perhaps more interesting. El Paraíso may not represent an isolated beginning. Instead, it could be one visible part of a much larger process that unfolded across coastal Peru over centuries. Other settlements, ceremonial centers, villages, and agricultural communities may have participated in networks whose full structure has not yet been reconstructed. Archaeology often gives the impression that civilizations suddenly appear when a monumental site is discovered. In reality, complexity usually develops gradually. Before a massive structure can be built, there must already be knowledge of materials, food production, social cooperation, transport, seasonal planning, and communication. El Paraíso therefore raises questions not only about the buildings themselves, but about everything that came before them. The site also challenges the assumption that early monumental architecture required agriculture alone. For decades, researchers have debated the role of marine resources in the development of complex societies along the Peruvian coast. El Paraíso contributes to that discussion because its inhabitants lived within a landscape where the sea could provide abundant resources while rivers supported agriculture. Perhaps the emergence of monumental architecture was not tied to one economic formula. Perhaps several strategies could produce the same result. Enough food, enough stability, and enough social cooperation to mobilize labor on a large scale. Then there is the passage of time. El Paraíso was not built in a single moment. Structures were constructed, modified, abandoned, and reused. Some spaces were filled or altered, while others received new architectural additions. Each layer represents a decision made by people whose names have not survived. A wall repaired after damage, a room redesigned for a new function, a ceremonial space altered by a later generation. These small changes can reveal something profound. The site was not static. It was a living place that changed as its society changed. Eventually, however, the complex ceased to function in the way its builders intended. There is no universally accepted explanation for its abandonment. Environmental changes, shifting settlement patterns, economic transformations, social reorganization, or changes in ritual practices may all have contributed. The evidence does not provide a single dramatic event that closes the story. And so, El Paraíso remains suspended between what can be demonstrated and what must still be inferred. We can measure its platforms. We can map its buildings. We can examine its construction materials. We can date organic remains and study the artifacts left behind. But the voices of the people who gathered there are absent. Standing among the low walls today, the site can seem almost modest compared with the monumental centers that came later. Yet, that modest appearance conceals the scale of the achievement. Around 5,000 years ago, communities on the Peruvian coast were already transforming the landscape through organized construction, creating spaces whose social and ceremonial purposes extended far beyond the simple need for shelter. The true enigma may therefore not be how these structures were built. It may be why this particular form of collective life emerged here, how far its networks extended, and what ideas brought people together strongly enough to reshape the earth on such a scale. As excavation continues and new evidence is compared with older discoveries, El Paraíso may gradually reveal more of its story. From the monumental platforms of El Paraíso, our journey now moves north toward the dry interior valleys of British Columbia, where the landscape offers a very different kind of archaeological and cultural puzzle. Near Okanagan Lake, a small body of water transforms dramatically with the seasons, dividing into dozens of mineral-rich pools that resemble a mosaic scattered across the earth. This is Spotted Lake, known as Tlaloc, a place of deep cultural significance to the Silex people. In summer, as water evaporates beneath the intense interior sun, the lake's surface can change almost completely. Large rounded patches emerge in shades of white, yellow, green, and blue, separated by narrow mineral ridges. From a distance, the effect is almost otherworldly, yet the underlying process is firmly grounded in geology. The lake is highly saline and contains unusually high concentrations of minerals, including magnesium sulfate, calcium, and sodium sulfates, along with other dissolved substances. During the warmer months, evaporation reduces the water level and causes minerals to crystallize, creating the distinctive pools that give the lake its familiar appearance. Nothing about this process requires an extraordinary explanation. And yet, the significance of Tlaloc cannot be measured in mineral composition alone. For generations, the Silex people have regarded the lake as a sacred place associated with healing and cultural traditions. Historical accounts describe the mineral-rich waters as having medicinal importance, while the site itself formed part of a much broader indigenous relationship with the landscape. Here, geology and cultural memory intersect. A modern scientific description might begin with chemistry: evaporation, concentration, crystallization, seasonal fluctuations. A cultural interpretation begins somewhere else, with relationships between people, water, land, and inherited knowledge. Both perspectives reveal something about the site, but neither completely captures its meaning. The lake sits within the Okanagan Valley, an environment shaped by dry summers, cold winters, surrounding hills, and a network of lakes and rivers. For the Sioux, these landscapes were not simply physical geography. They were part of a living cultural world governed by stories, responsibilities, place-based knowledge, and long-established practices. Tlaloc, therefore, cannot be understood simply as an unusual geological formation. Its importance comes partly from the way generations of people interpreted and respected the place. That history became especially complicated during the modern era. In the early 20th century, mineral-rich water from the lake attracted commercial interest. During the First World War, minerals from the lake were reportedly extracted for industrial purposes, and the site became increasingly vulnerable to outside development. The contrast is striking. A place regarded by the Sioux as sacred and culturally important was being evaluated through a very different framework, as a potential source of commercially valuable minerals. What happens when two completely different ideas of value meet at the same landscape? For one perspective, the lake's unusual chemistry represented an economic resource. For another, its importance extended far beyond what could be extracted from the water. This tension eventually became part of a longer effort to protect the site. Today, access to the lake is restricted, and visitors are generally expected to view it from a distance rather than entering the area or approaching the mineral pools. The restrictions reflect both environmental concerns and the cultural importance of the site. Yet, even from outside, the visual transformation remains remarkable. During wetter months, the lake can appear relatively ordinary. Water covers much of the surface, reducing the visual separation between its mineral-rich basins. As summer progresses, evaporation concentrates the dissolved minerals. Pools become increasingly distinct, their colors influenced by mineral composition, water depth, microorganisms, and changing environmental conditions. The landscape seems to rearrange itself without human intervention. A lake that appears whole in one season becomes divided into separate circles and ovals in another. Could this transformation have contributed to the site's cultural significance? It is impossible to establish precisely how every historical generation interpreted the changing appearance of Tlaloc. Indigenous traditions should not be reduced to simple explanations based on modern geology. Cultural knowledge operates through its own systems of meaning. Still, the recurring transformation would have been impossible to overlook. People returning to the same location year after year could witness the water changing as the seasons advanced. The lake's appearance was not fixed. It responded visibly to heat, rainfall, evaporation, and the changing balance of minerals. To a modern scientist, this is an environmental process. To a community with a long relationship to the landscape, the same transformation could carry layers of cultural significance. The distinction is important because some modern accounts have attempted to surround Spotted Lake with claims of unexplained powers or extraordinary healing properties. Such claims should be treated cautiously. There is evidence that the lake contains mineral-rich waters, and there are long-standing indigenous traditions concerning its importance. But scientific research does not establish supernatural properties. The real story is more nuanced. Minerals can have physical effects on the body. Certain mineral waters have historically been valued for bathing or therapeutic use, but that does not automatically validate every claim associated with sacred landscapes. At the same time, dismissing the site's cultural tradition simply because they cannot be tested in a laboratory would overlook another form of evidence: the historical continuity of indigenous relationships with the land. Archaeology and anthropology often encounter this boundary. Physical evidence can establish what happened to a landscape. Cultural knowledge can preserve why a place mattered. Neither should automatically be treated as a substitute for the other. Tlaloc also raises questions about environmental change. The lake's appearance depends heavily on water balance. Temperature, precipitation, evaporation, and groundwater conditions can influence its chemistry and seasonal pattern. Changes in climate or regional water use could therefore alter the visual character of the site over time. What might happen if those delicate conditions change significantly? A landscape that has remained culturally important for generations could look very different under a changing climate. This makes preservation more complicated than simply protecting the shoreline. The lake is part of a broader environmental system. Its mineral concentrations, water levels, surrounding vegetation, and seasonal rhythms are interconnected. Protecting the site means preserving not only an unusual geological formation, but also the cultural relationship attached to it. There is another intriguing aspect of Qiluk. The individual pools are not identical. Their colors and shapes can vary, sometimes becoming more pronounced as evaporation progresses. Minerals crystallize around the edges, forming natural barriers that separate one basin from another. The result is a landscape that resembles a collection of miniature lakes contained within a larger lake. The pattern is natural, but its appearance can feel almost deliberately organized. That visual impression has encouraged speculative descriptions of the site as something engineered or artificially arranged. There is no credible archaeological evidence that humans created the mineral pools. Their formation is adequately explained by natural processes. But the fact that a natural explanation exists does not make the place any less compelling. In fact, the opposite may be true. A landscape capable of producing such dramatic patterns without human intervention reminds us how much complexity can emerge from simple physical laws operating over time. Water evaporates. Minerals concentrate. Crystals form. Pools separate. And an entirely new landscape appears. Yet, the scientific explanation does not answer every question. It tells us how the pools form, but not everything about how generations of Silex people understood them. It explains the chemistry, but not the cultural memory attached to the shore. It describes physical processes, but it cannot fully reconstruct the experiences of people who regarded the lake as a place of healing and significance. Those questions belong to another dimension of investigation. Standing near Qiluk, one can see how easily a landscape can become more than geography. A body of water can become a landmark, a source of medicine, a sacred place, a cultural reference point, and a reminder of continuity between generations. The mineral pools may be explainable. Their cultural meaning is not something that can be reduced to a chemical formula, and perhaps that is where the deeper uncertainty remains. The lake itself changes every year, responding to forces that can be measured and modeled. Yet, the human story surrounding it contains layers that are harder to quantify. Traditions have survived, landscapes have changed, outside interests have come and gone, and the mineral pools continue their seasonal transformation. From the mineral pools of Qiluk, our journey now returns to the eastern Mediterranean, to the rolling landscape of northern Palestine, where layers of settlement have accumulated over thousands of years. Near the modern town of Yokneam, an archaeological site rises from the edge of the Jezreel Valley, its stone remains preserving traces of communities that occupied this strategic landscape again and again. Among those remains is a particularly intriguing megalithic feature, a massive stone construction incorporated into the ancient settlement known as Tel Yokneam. At first, the structure can seem like little more than another fragment of a ruined wall. Yet its scale and construction invite closer attention. Large stones, some substantially heavier than ordinary building blocks, form part of an architectural sequence that belongs to a much wider history of fortification and settlement in the region. The landscape itself helps explain why people repeatedly chose this location. Tel Yokneam stands near an important route connecting the Mediterranean coastal plain with the interior valleys and the Galilee. From elevated ground, movement through the surrounding countryside could be observed, while nearby agricultural land provided access to essential resources. For thousands of years, strategic geography shaped human decisions here. But the particular stonework at Yokneam raises a different question. Why were such substantial blocks used, and what role did this megalithic segment serve within the settlement? Archaeology offers several possibilities. The most conventional interpretation is defensive architecture. Large stone foundations and retaining structures are common at ancient fortified settlements, particularly where walls had to withstand pressure from slopes, weather, and repeated reconstruction. Heavy masonry could provide stability and create a durable base for upper walls constructed from smaller stones or other materials. There is nothing inherently extraordinary about that technique. Yet, the scale of certain stone elements at ancient sites throughout the region has repeatedly attracted attention. Builders were working with materials that could weigh hundreds or even thousands of kilograms, moving them without cranes, engines, or modern transport systems. The question is therefore not whether ancient people possessed unexplained technology. They clearly possessed practical knowledge of stoneworking, leverage, ramps, sledges, organized labor, and construction planning. The more interesting question is how these techniques were coordinated. At Tel Yokneam, the answer may lie in the site's long history of occupation. The Tel itself is not a single settlement frozen in time. Like many major archaeological mounds in the Levant, it represents the accumulation of numerous occupation layers. Buildings were constructed, modified, destroyed, rebuilt, and sometimes abandoned before later communities established themselves on the same ground. A massive wall segment may therefore represent only one phase in a much longer architectural sequence. That makes interpretation difficult. A stone block removed from its original position can lose much of its meaning. A wall rebuilt centuries later may incorporate older material. Foundations can survive while upper structures disappear completely. What appears to be one continuous monument may actually be the result of several building campaigns separated by generations. Could this be part of what makes the megalithic segment at Yokneam so difficult to interpret? Perhaps. Archaeological excavation attempts to reconstruct those stages through stratigraphy, the relationship between layers, structures, artifacts, and deposits. When the sequence is clear, even a ruined wall can reveal a surprisingly detailed history. But when evidence is incomplete, several interpretations can remain possible. Tel Yokneam's strategic location adds another dimension. The Jezreel Valley has long served as a natural corridor between different regions. Armies, merchants, farmers, and travelers could move through the surrounding landscape, while settlements positioned near major routes could benefit from trade or become targets during periods of conflict. A fortified settlement in such a location needed more than walls. It required food storage, water management, administrative organization, and a population capable of maintaining defensive infrastructure. The stone segment, therefore, may have been one component of a larger system. Yet, later writers and popular accounts sometimes interpret large masonry at Levantine sites as evidence of civilizations possessing knowledge that conventional archaeology supposedly cannot explain. Some fringe theories go further, proposing lost engineering traditions or forgotten technological systems. Such ideas are difficult to substantiate. There is currently no reliable archaeological evidence showing that the builders of Tel Yokneam required technologies outside the capabilities known from the ancient Near East. But examining these theories can still reveal something useful. They often arise because modern observers underestimate the sophistication of ancient construction. Without modern machinery, moving enormous stones appears almost impossible. Yet, experimental archaeology and studies of ancient building techniques demonstrate that organized labor, wooden rollers, sledges, ropes, ramps, levers, and careful planning can accomplish remarkable feats. The mystery, then, may not be technological at all. It may be social. How many workers were required? How long did the construction take? Who organized them? Where did the food come from? What political authority could command such an investment? These questions can sometimes be more revealing than the stone itself. A massive wall represents a commitment of resources. It tells us that someone believed the structure was worth building. That decision may have been motivated by warfare, political authority, territorial control, or the prestige associated with monumental construction. Perhaps the wall communicated power as much as it provided protection. There is also the possibility that the megalithic construction served several functions simultaneously. Ancient architecture rarely fits perfectly into modern categories. A defensive wall could also define sacred space. A retaining structure could support a monumental platform. A gateway could regulate both military movement and ceremonial processions. Without written descriptions of the structure's original purpose, archaeologists must reconstruct its function from context. And context is precisely what makes Tel Yokneam valuable. The site was not isolated. It belonged to a densely inhabited landscape where settlements interacted with one another through trade, conflict, agriculture, and cultural exchange. Architectural techniques could spread between communities, while local traditions could persist for centuries. The large stones at Yokneam may therefore reflect a regional building tradition rather than a unique technological achievement. Still, their survival is remarkable. Upper walls have disappeared. Wooden beams have decayed. Roofs have collapsed. Objects have been moved or destroyed. Yet, massive stones remain, anchoring the archaeological record to the ground. They become physical witnesses to decisions made by people whose identities are only partially recoverable. There is something particularly evocative about this kind of evidence. A written inscription can tell us what a ruler wanted remembered. A palace can demonstrate wealth. A tomb can reveal burial practices, but a huge defensive wall speaks differently. It reveals effort. Someone quarried the stone. Someone shaped or positioned it. Someone transported it. Someone planned where it would stand. And countless others may have supported the project indirectly by producing food, tools, materials, and transport. The structure is therefore evidence not only of architecture but of collective organization. Yet, the surviving stones cannot tell us whether the people who built them felt secure behind the walls or whether they lived under constant threat. They cannot tell us whether construction was celebrated as a communal achievement or imposed by an authority. They cannot tell us how ordinary inhabitants perceived the monumental structures surrounding them. Those questions remain beyond the reach of stone alone. This is where the archaeological mystery of Tel Yokneam becomes more subtle. The unresolved issue is not necessarily the existence of the megalithic construction, nor is there strong evidence that it was produced by an unknown civilization or extraordinary technology. The uncertainty lies in the precise sequence of construction, the complete function of the massive masonry, and the social world that made such architecture possible. As excavation, comparison, and analysis continue, individual pieces of that story may become clearer. But every answer can create another question. A wall tells us that defense mattered. A strategic location suggests movement and competition. A substantial investment in masonry points toward organized authority. Yet, the people themselves remain largely silent. And so, standing among the stones of Tel Yokneam, the most compelling mystery may be found not in how these massive blocks could be moved, but in why this community chose to transform the landscape so dramatically, and what pressures, ambitions, or beliefs compelled generations of builders to raise defenses whose fragments still survive today. The stones remain fixed. From the mineral pools of Kliluk and the monumental stones of Tel Yokneam, our journey now moves across the seas to Bali, where the landscape itself seems to guide the visitor toward something concealed within its folds. In the lush highlands near Tampaxiring, the Pakarasan River cuts through a deep green ravine, bordered by terraced rice fields, steep rock faces, and dense tropical vegetation. Here, carved directly into the cliffs, stand the shrines of Gunung Kawi. They rise from the stone as though they were buildings placed against the mountain, yet they are not constructed in the conventional sense. They were cut into the living rock, creating monumental facades several meters high. 10 principal rock-cut shrines are distributed on both sides of the river, accompanied by meditation caves, carved passages, water channels, and other sacred structures. The setting is remarkably intimate. Water moves constantly through the ravine. Vegetation clings to the cliffs. The sound of the river competes with the distant calls of birds, while above the valley, rice terraces extend toward the surrounding hills. It is difficult to separate the architecture from the landscape, and that may have been precisely the intention. Gunung Kawi belongs primarily to the 11th century AD, during the period of the Udayana Warmadewa dynasty. Archaeological and inscriptional evidence places the development of the complex within the reigns of Marakata, and particularly Anak Wongsu, who ruled Bali during the middle of the 11th century. Indonesian heritage authorities associate the site with sacred activities, ancestor veneration, meditation, and religious education. Yet the term royal tombs, often used to describe the monuments, requires some caution. The shrines do not contain the physical remains of the rulers they commemorate. Cremation was practiced, and the memorial structures appear to have functioned as sacred monuments associated with royal ancestors rather than conventional burial chambers. The National Museum of Asian Art notes that no bodily relics remain at the site, while sacred materials were placed within compartments associated with the shrines. So, what exactly was Gunung Kawi intended to accomplish? Was it a memorial complex for a royal family? A place where the deceased were symbolically connected with the divine? A center of meditation and religious instruction? Or did several of these functions coexist? The surviving evidence suggests that the answer may be more complicated than any single description. The main group consists of 5 monumental shrines carved into the eastern cliff face. Across the Pakarasan River, 4 more stand on the western side, while a 10th monument lies somewhat farther away. Inscriptions carved into the stone provide important clues about their associations. One inscription has been read as referring to a king commemorated at Jalu, while another mentions 2 sons, interpretations that have contributed to the identification of members of the royal family. But inscriptions are fragments. They preserve names and titles, not complete explanations. The identity of the people commemorated can be debated. The precise relationship between individual shrines and members of the dynasty is not universally settled. Different interpretations have assigned the monuments to different combinations of rulers, relatives, wives, and royal officials. That uncertainty becomes particularly fascinating when the architecture is considered alongside the inscriptions. The builders did not simply carve portraits of their rulers into the cliff. Instead, they created architectural forms, shrine facades resembling freestanding sacred buildings, while leaving the rock around them intact. The effect is extraordinary. The monument appears to emerge from the cliff without being detached from it. Why choose this method? One explanation is practical and geological. Carving into the local rock allowed builders to create large monumental forms without transporting enormous quantities of stone. But practicality alone does not explain the visual impact. The mountain itself became part of the monument. The distinction between landscape and architecture began to disappear. The National Museum of Asian Art describes the site as an environment where water moves through both sacred structures and agricultural terraces, suggesting that the designers deliberately incorporated the natural flow of the ravine into the complex. This relationship with water may be one of Gunung Kawi's most significant features. The Paraíso River was not merely a convenient source of water. The broader river valley became a sacred landscape containing multiple archaeological sites, including rock-cut temples, hermitage niches, and other structures dating broadly from the 10th to 13th centuries. Research by Indonesian archaeologists indicates that these constructions could serve sacred, ritual, and sometimes more ordinary architectural functions. At Gunung Kawi, channels and pools were incorporated into the environment. Water could be diverted and directed through the complex, linking the sacred architecture with the river below. The movement of water would have been constant, changing with rainfall, season, and the natural rhythm of the valley. For a religious community, that was more than an engineering detail. Water held profound significance within the religious traditions of Bali and the wider Hindu-Buddhist world of Southeast Asia. Purification, fertility, sacred geography, and the movement between different realms were frequently connected with water. Could the river have helped shape the spiritual experience of the site? The architecture certainly suggests that the environment was not an afterthought. The shrines face the river. The meditation spaces occupy the cliffs. Water channels run through the complex. Terraced fields surround the sacred landscape. The result is a place in which agriculture, religion, royal memory, and natural geography intersect. Yet, Gunung Kawi contains another feature that deepens the sense of uncertainty: the meditation caves. Carved into the cliffs, these spaces are smaller and far less monumental than the royal shrines. Their scale suggests intimate use. They may have served ascetics, monks, or religious practitioners seeking secluded spaces for meditation and contemplation. Indonesian heritage documentation connects the complex with religious education and meditation, while broader archaeological research identifies hermitage niches as an important category of rock-cut architecture along the Paraíso River. Here, the contrast is striking. The royal shrines proclaim presence. The caves withdraw from it. One speaks of dynastic memory and monumental authority. The other suggests solitude. Why were both placed within the same sacred landscape? Perhaps the relationship between kingship and religious practice was closer than modern categories suggest. In early Bali, royal power and religious authority were not necessarily separate spheres. A ruler could be remembered not simply as a political leader, but as a figure whose posthumous status remained connected with sacred traditions. Gunung Kawi may therefore have served as a bridge between political memory and spiritual practice. But then comes the legend. Local tradition tells of Kebo Iwa, a powerful figure associated with extraordinary strength, who supposedly carved the monuments into the rock using his fingernails in a single night. Taken literally, the story is impossible within the known physical evidence. The monuments required substantial labor and sophisticated stoneworking techniques. Their forms, inscriptions, and relationship to surrounding structures indicate deliberate construction over time, rather than a supernatural act completed in a single night. Yet, dismissing the legend entirely would also miss its cultural significance. Legends are not archaeological reports. They can preserve ideas about strength, sacred authority, heroic figures, and the relationship between human beings and extraordinary landscapes. The story of Kebo Iwa transforms a difficult engineering achievement into a narrative of almost impossible effort. In that sense, the legend may tell us something about how later generations perceived the monument, even if it cannot explain how the carving physically occurred. Modern archaeology offers a different story. Stone was selected, surfaces were prepared, forms were outlined, rock was removed, details were carved, inscribed panels were added, sacred spaces were organized around the river. The process was laborious, but it was achievable using the technologies available to 11th century Balinese builders. And yet the scale remains impressive. Each shrine represents an enormous subtraction of material. Unlike a freestanding monument, which can be assembled piece by piece, a rock-cut monument must be created by removing everything that does not belong. A mistake cannot simply be replaced with another block. The cliff itself becomes the raw material. That raises an intriguing question. How did the builders plan their work before beginning? There are no surviving architectural drawings showing the complete design. The evidence must therefore be reconstructed from the finished forms, tool marks, proportions, inscriptions, and comparisons with other sacred architecture of the period. The architectural vocabulary also suggests connections beyond Bali. The forms of the shrines have parallels with freestanding Kandi architecture in Java, while the rock-cut technique recalls broader traditions of sacred architecture elsewhere in South and Southeast Asia. Such similarities do not prove direct copying, but they demonstrate that the builders participated in a wider cultural world of architectural ideas. So perhaps Gunung Kawi was not an isolated experiment. It may have been a distinctly Balinese expression of ideas circulating throughout the region. From the carved cliffs of Gunung Kawi, our journey now returns to the high Andes, where stone architecture takes on an entirely different scale. In the sacred valley of Peru, surrounded by steep mountains and narrow agricultural terraces, the settlement of Ollantaytambo rises from the valley floor in layers of finely fitted masonry. Above it, the mountain slopes climb sharply toward the sky, and on one elevated terrace stand the enormous wall blocks that have made Ollantaytambo one of the most closely examined stone sites in the Andes. 6 colossal red porphyry blocks form the central portion of the so-called Temple of the Sun, although the original function of the unfinished complex remains debated. Each stone is massive, carefully shaped, and positioned with remarkable precision. Their surfaces display projecting elements, recessed areas, and carefully prepared faces that suggest deliberate architectural planning rather than rough defensive construction. The visual impression is immediate. These are not ordinary building stones. They are enormous pieces of a carefully designed monumental structure, positioned high above the valley. Yet, the mystery begins with something deceptively simple. Where did these stones come from? Geological studies indicate that the large red porphyry blocks were quarried from an area across the valley, near the slopes of the mountain known as Cerro Pinqueluna. The source is not adjacent to the structure. The stones had to be extracted, shaped, transported across difficult terrain, and raised to the elevated construction area. This is where the scale of the achievement becomes clearer. The Inca builders did not have iron cranes, wheeled construction vehicles, or modern lifting equipment. Their transportation systems relied heavily on human labor, rope technology, prepared paths, sledges, levers, earthen ramps, and carefully organized teams. So, how were these immense blocks moved? The mainstream explanation is demanding, but entirely plausible. Stone could be dragged using ropes made from strong natural fibers, while large groups of workers coordinated their movements. Wooden elements, rollers where appropriate, lubricated surfaces, ramps, and prepared tracks could reduce friction or change the direction of movement. The exact technique may have varied according to the slope, terrain, and shape of the block. Archaeological evidence from the Andes demonstrates that Inca builders possessed sophisticated knowledge of quarrying and stone transportation. The real question is not whether they could move massive stones. It is how they managed the enormous logistical operation with such precision. A single block could require hundreds of workers. Food had to be supplied. Ropes had to be produced and maintained. Paths had to be prepared. Workers had to be coordinated, and the stone itself had to survive the journey without catastrophic cracking. The construction was therefore an exercise in organization as much as engineering. Ollantaytambo provides evidence of this organizational capacity throughout the site. Terraces climb the slopes. Water channels follow carefully planned routes. Stone walls stabilize steep terrain. Buildings are arranged according to functional and ceremonial requirements. The settlement itself appears to have been conceived as a highly integrated landscape rather than a collection of unrelated structures. The enormous wall blocks belong to that larger system. Their unfinished state, however, adds another layer to the puzzle. The 6 principal blocks were never incorporated into a completed wall in the way the builders appear to have intended. Their surfaces display varying degrees of finishing, and some architectural elements appear incomplete. Why did construction stop? One possibility is political disruption. Ollantaytambo was an important Inca settlement during the final decades of the empire. It became associated with resistance against the Spanish invasion in the 16th century, particularly during the reign of Manco Inca. The site was already a major center before the Spanish arrived, but the upheaval of conquest disrupted construction and changed the political circumstances surrounding the settlement. Could unfinished masonry reflect that interruption? It is possible, but there may have been earlier reasons for construction changes as well. Monumental projects can be abandoned, redesigned, relocated, or modified for many reasons. A change in royal priorities, a shift in political authority, resource constraints, or a decision to alter the architectural plan could leave large stones stranded in apparently incomplete positions. The stones themselves do not provide a final explanation. They simply preserve the state in which construction ended. This has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some popular theories claim that the precision of the masonry and the enormous size of the blocks imply technology far beyond what is normally attributed to the Inca. Others suggest unknown lifting systems or forgotten engineering methods. There is no convincing archaeological evidence for advanced machinery or an unknown civilization at Ollantaytambo. The Inca world already possessed a sophisticated construction tradition capable of extraordinary results through labor organization and mechanical principles. Yet, it would be equally simplistic to dismiss the achievement as merely primitive labor. That word fails to describe what is actually visible. The builders understood stone. They recognized natural fractures. They exploited grain and bedding. They shaped surfaces with controlled impacts. They fitted blocks through repeated adjustment. They understood how weight, slope, friction, and structural stability interacted. Their tools were different from ours. Their engineering principles were not. The most fascinating aspect of Ollantaytambo may therefore be the meeting point between enormous scale and minute precision. Some blocks are immense, yet their contact surfaces were carefully prepared. Certain stones contain interlocking shapes that resist lateral movement. Corners and joints were engineered to distribute forces. The result is architecture that can remain stable despite earthquakes and centuries of weathering. This becomes particularly important in the Andes. Peru is one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. Earthquakes have repeatedly damaged colonial and modern structures across the country, yet many Inca walls have survived because of their construction techniques. The stones were not simply placed one on another. They were fitted. Their irregular joints could absorb movement. Slightly inclined walls and carefully shaped blocks contributed to stability. The enormous wall blocks at Ollantaytambo therefore belong to a broader engineering tradition designed for a landscape in which earthquakes were an unavoidable reality. But another mystery remains. Why build such an immense structure here? Ollantaytambo occupies a strategically important position in the Sacred Valley. It controls access along the valley corridor and sits within a landscape capable of supporting agriculture through extensive terraces and irrigation. Its location offered both economic and military advantages. Yet, the monumental architecture suggests that symbolism mattered as well. Mountains surrounding the settlement were not simply obstacles. In Andean cosmology, landscapes could possess profound sacred significance. Mountains, springs, caves, and other natural formations could be incorporated into systems of ritual and political meaning. The placement of monumental stone architecture against this dramatic mountain environment may therefore have communicated more than practical power. It may have connected the authority of the Inca state with the sacred geography of the valley. The so-called Temple of the Sun is especially difficult to interpret because its intended final form was never completed. Its surviving blocks provide clues, but not a complete architectural plan. Was it intended as a temple, a ceremonial platform, a royal monument, a structure associated with astronomical observation? Different interpretations have been proposed, and the evidence remains insufficient to settle every detail. The uncertainty becomes more pronounced when we examine the stones individually. Some have been cut into unusual shapes. Others contain projecting sections that appear to have been designed to connect with neighboring blocks. Their surfaces preserve evidence of a construction process that was interrupted before the final stage. Could the unfinished state itself tell us something? Perhaps the most important evidence is not what the builders completed, but what they were still attempting when work stopped. An unfinished monument is a rare archaeological document. A completed structure shows the final result. An unfinished structure can reveal the process. It exposes the sequence of shaping, positioning, fitting, and adjustment. In Ollantaytambo, the enormous stones preserve a moment when an ambitious project was still underway. Then history changed. The Inca political world entered a period of civil conflict between rival royal factions. European invasion followed. Disease devastated populations. The Spanish conquest transformed the political and economic structures of the Andes. Whatever plans existed for the unfinished monumental complex were never fully realized. The stones remained. Today, visitors can stand before them and see the traces of an engineering project that ended centuries ago. The mountains still surround the valley. The terraces still follow the slopes. The stones still fit together with a precision that invites admiration. But the workers are gone. Their instructions are gone. From the immense wall blocks of Ollantaytambo, our journey now leaves the high Andes and moves eastward into northeastern Brazil, where a single granite outcrop carries one of South America's most debated collections of prehistoric engravings. Near the municipality of Ingá, in the state of Paraíso, the Ingá Stone rises beside the Ingá River. Its broad rock surface is covered with hundreds of carved marks, spirals, geometric forms, circles, depressions, and shapes that resemble animals or celestial symbols. Weathered by time and exposed to the elements, the engravings stretch across the stone like a visual language whose full meaning remains uncertain. The setting is deceptively peaceful. Water moves through the river channel. Vegetation surrounds the granite formation. Sunlight shifts across the carved surface throughout the day, revealing some markings while leaving others subdued beneath layers of weathering. For decades, the site has attracted archaeologists, historians, indigenous rights advocates, and enthusiasts of alternative history. Why were these markings created? Who made them? And perhaps most importantly, what were they intended to communicate? The first challenge is chronology. Unlike inscriptions carved into stone monuments bearing recognizable historical scripts, the Ingá engravings do not provide an obvious date. There is no surviving inscription identifying a ruler, settlement, or historical event. The markings must therefore be studied through archaeological context, stylistic comparison, weathering, and the evidence surrounding the site. That has made precise dating difficult. Some researchers have proposed prehistoric origins, while others have suggested much more recent dates. There is no universally accepted archaeological chronology that explains every carving at Ingá. This uncertainty has allowed the site to become a magnet for speculation. Some writers have claimed that the engravings represent an ancient writing system. Others have interpreted individual symbols as depictions of stars, constellations, astronomical cycles, or even maps. More radical interpretations have suggested that the carvings were produced by civilizations arriving from distant parts of the world, or even by visitors from beyond Earth. There is no reliable evidence supporting those extraordinary claims. Yet, the markings themselves remain worthy of investigation without them. The surface of the rock is undeniably deliberate. Some grooves are deep and carefully defined. Others are shallow and weathered. Repeated geometric forms appear in different areas. Cup-like depressions and circular motifs occur alongside more complex patterns. The challenge is distinguishing intentional symbolism from natural features and later modifications. Rock surfaces are deceptive. Cracks can resemble lines. Weathering can create patterns. Natural cavities can appear deliberately circular, and when humans search for familiar shapes, the mind naturally organizes ambiguous marks into recognizable images. This is one reason archaeologists approach the Ingá Stone cautiously. A spiral may represent a deliberate symbol, or it may belong to a larger design whose original context has been lost. A series of circular depressions may have symbolic significance, or they could have served a practical purpose. Without supporting artifacts, dated occupation layers, or a known writing system, interpretation remains difficult. Still, some features have attracted particular attention. Among the most frequently discussed are motifs resembling stars, suns, animals, and geometric arrangements. Some visitors have interpreted them as evidence of astronomical knowledge. The possibility of astronomical symbolism is not inherently implausible. Many prehistoric societies observed the sky carefully. Solar cycles, lunar phases, seasonal changes, and the movement of prominent stars could influence agriculture, navigation, ritual, and timekeeping. But identifying a carved shape as a constellation requires more than visual resemblance. Researchers would need evidence showing that the arrangement corresponds consistently with a known astronomical pattern, that the orientation is meaningful, and that the interpretation fits the archaeological context. At Ingá, those connections remain debated. The problem becomes even greater when attempting to interpret the entire surface as a single message. Perhaps the markings were created during different periods. Perhaps separate groups added symbols over generations. Perhaps some motifs belonged to ritual practices while others served more ordinary purposes. The rock may not represent one unified inscription at all. It may instead be a layered record of human interaction with the landscape. That possibility deserves serious attention. Rock art sites around the world were often revisited. A location that carried cultural importance could remain significant for generations, with new markings added beside older ones. Over time, the surface could become a complex accumulation of symbols created by people who did not share identical intentions. Could Ingá be such a place? Without secure dates for individual engravings, it is difficult to know. There is another important question. Who were the people responsible? The region was inhabited by indigenous populations long before European colonization. However, assigning a specific ethnic group to prehistoric engravings is difficult without direct evidence. Oral traditions can preserve knowledge about landscapes, but connecting a particular tradition to a particular carving requires careful documentation. This has not stopped the Ingá Stone from becoming part of larger cultural debates. Some popular accounts have attempted to connect its markings with Phoenicians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, or other distant civilizations. These claims are generally based on perceived similarities between individual symbols rather than archaeological evidence of contact. The idea can be appealing. If a spiral resembles a symbol from one culture, and a geometric pattern resembles another, Perhaps the two traditions were connected. But similarity does not demonstrate contact. Simple geometric forms can emerge independently in many societies because human beings work with the same basic visual vocabulary: circles, lines, spirals, grids, triangles, and repeated patterns. A circle does not belong to one civilization, neither does a spiral. This is why the most responsible approach is to begin with the evidence available at the site itself. The Ingá Stone is located in a region rich in indigenous archaeological history. Nearby areas contain evidence of prehistoric occupation, including rock art traditions that demonstrate long-term human interaction with the northeastern Brazilian landscape. Within that context, the engravings do not need an overseas explanation to become significant. They could represent local knowledge, ritual practice, symbolic communication, territorial identity, or a combination of purposes. Perhaps the people who carved them were expressing ideas that were perfectly understandable within their own cultural system, but became inaccessible when the traditions that explained the symbols disappeared. That possibility is particularly haunting. A symbol can survive longer than its language. A groove can remain visible for centuries after everyone who understood it has died. At Ingá, the stone may preserve the form of a message while losing the cultural key required to interpret it. Modern technology has opened new possibilities for studying such sites. High-resolution photography, three-dimensional scanning, digital modeling, microscopic examination, and geographic analysis can reveal differences in carving depth, tool marks, surface weathering, and spatial organization. These methods may eventually help distinguish older engravings from later additions and separate deliberate human modifications from natural features. But technology has limitations. A perfect three-dimensional model can reproduce every groove on the rock. It cannot automatically tell us what those grooves meant. Meaning belongs to cultural context, and that context may be the very thing that has disappeared. The most speculative theories surrounding Ingá often focus on the apparent complexity of the engravings. Some have suggested that the site records an advanced astronomical system, or an ancient form of writing. Could prehistoric communities have possessed sophisticated knowledge of the sky? Certainly. Could they have used symbols to encode information? Certainly. But neither possibility proves that the Ingá Stone contains a formal written text or astronomical chart. The distinction between possibility and evidence is crucial. A mystery becomes more interesting, not less, when uncertainty is acknowledged honestly. The stone does not need extraterrestrial visitors or forgotten global empires to be extraordinary. Its real significance may lie in the fact that human beings, thousands of years ago, deliberately transformed a natural rock surface into a place filled with symbols and left us no surviving explanation for the system behind them. Even the word writing may be too restrictive. Perhaps the carvings were not intended to record spoken language. They may have represented rituals, places, stories, identities, animals, celestial observations, or concepts that cannot be translated into modern categories. A sequence of symbols does not necessarily constitute a sentence. It could be a memory aid, a ceremonial pattern, a territorial marker, a record of events, or something entirely different. Standing beside the Ingá Stone today, the temptation is to search for a single grand answer. From the carved granite of the Ingá Stone, our journey now moves across the Atlantic to the highlands of Ethiopia, where the remains of a royal complex rise from the earth near one of the most important archaeological landscapes in the Horn of Africa. Near the ancient city of Aksum, reddish-brown stone walls and weathered foundations mark the remains known as Dungur, sometimes called the Dungur Palace or Dungur Stonehouse. The ruins occupy a gently elevated area west of the historic center, where the dry highland landscape stretches toward distant hills. At first sight, Dungur appears almost understated. There are no towering walls comparable to later medieval fortresses, and much of the original structure has disappeared. What remains is a complicated arrangement of foundations, rooms, courtyards, corridors, and stonework spread across the site. Yet, archaeologists believe these ruins once formed part of a substantial elite residence or palace complex associated with the Aksumite period, roughly between the 6th and 7th centuries AD. And that immediately places Dungur within one of Africa's most important historical centers. Aksum was not an isolated highland settlement. Between roughly the 1st and 8th centuries AD, the Aksumite kingdom developed into a powerful state whose influence extended across parts of northern Ethiopia and Eritrea and into Red Sea trade networks. Its rulers controlled or participated in commercial exchanges involving goods such as ivory, precious materials, textiles, agricultural products, and other commodities moving between Africa and Arabia. The monumental remains scattered around Aksum reflect that prosperity. Massive stone stelae dominate parts of the city. Royal tombs lie beneath the ground. Church traditions preserve memories of ancient rulers. Inscriptions record political authority, and Dungur provides another glimpse into the lives of the elite who inhabited this powerful kingdom. But the identity of the people who occupied the complex is not entirely certain. Some interpretations associate Dungur with a royal palace. Others describe it more cautiously as an elite residence or administrative complex. The archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates substantial architecture, but the precise social function of every room remains open to interpretation. This distinction matters. A building does not become a palace simply because it is large. Archaeologists look for evidence of elite occupation, architectural scale, ceremonial spaces, storage facilities, imported materials, administrative objects, and relationships with surrounding monuments. At Dungur, several features support the interpretation of a high-status complex. The site includes numerous rooms arranged around central spaces. Some areas appear to have been carefully planned, while stone foundations suggest walls that once supported upper structures made from materials that have not survived as completely. The original building would therefore have looked very different from the ruins visible today. Wooden components decayed. Roofs disappeared. Decorative surfaces deteriorated. Stone was reused elsewhere. What remains is only the most durable framework, and this is where the mystery begins. How did the original complex function? Was it a royal residence where rulers and their households lived? Was it a ceremonial center, an administrative headquarters, a combination of these functions? Perhaps the answer changed over time. Aksumite buildings were not necessarily designed for one purpose forever. Political circumstances changed. New rulers inherited existing structures. Rooms could be altered, expanded, or repurposed. The ruins may therefore represent several generations of architectural decisions rather than one completed plan. One of the most intriguing features associated with Dungur is the site's relationship to a larger network of monumental structures. Nearby stand the famous Aksumite stele fields and other archaeological remains. The proximity suggests that Dungur was part of a broader urban landscape rather than an isolated building. The city itself was complex. Monuments, residences, ritual areas, administrative spaces, workshops, and burial grounds existed within a wider environment shaped by political authority and trade. The palace, if that is indeed what Dungur was, would have been only one component of this system. Yet, popular accounts sometimes attach another identity to the ruins. Local tradition has connected the site with the Queen of Sheba, and some visitors have referred to Dungur as the Palace of the Queen of Sheba. The association is culturally fascinating, but archaeologically difficult to establish. The legendary Queen of Sheba appears in biblical, Ethiopian, and Islamic traditions under different names and in different narratives. Ethiopian tradition identifies her with Makeda and connects her story with King Solomon and the birth of Menelik I. However, Dungur's archaeological dating places its surviving architectural remains much later than the period traditionally associated with those stories. That does not diminish the importance of the tradition. It reveals how later generations connected monumental ruins with powerful figures from their cultural memory. Ruins often become stages upon which historical and legendary narratives overlap. A massive wall survives, but the identity of its original occupant is forgotten. Later communities encounter the structure and associate it with a famous ruler, ancestor, or sacred figure. The story becomes part of the site's history, even when archaeology cannot confirm the literal connection. Dungur demonstrates this tension particularly well. The archaeology belongs primarily to the Aksumite world. The legend reaches much farther back. Between them lies a long process of cultural memory. Another intriguing feature is the construction itself. The complex was built using stone foundations and masonry techniques adapted to the Ethiopian highlands. Some architectural elements reveal careful planning, while others suggest a building tradition that differs significantly from Mediterranean or Near Eastern palace architecture. This has occasionally encouraged speculative claims that Aksumite builders received direct technological assistance from distant civilizations. Again, there is no need to invoke unexplained intervention. Aksum existed within an active international network. Merchants, craftsmen, religious ideas, technologies, and artistic influences moved across the Red Sea and beyond. Aksumite architecture could therefore incorporate external influences while remaining distinctly African. This is important because ancient African societies are sometimes described as though monumental architecture required outside inspiration. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. Aksum developed its own political institutions, monumental traditions, writing system, coinage, and architectural styles. Its rulers issued coins bearing their names. Its inscriptions used the Ge'ez script. Its engineers created enormous stone monuments. Its political economy depended partly on sophisticated agricultural and commercial systems. Dungur belongs to that world. Perhaps its most important mystery is therefore not whether its builders possessed advanced knowledge. They clearly did. The more interesting question is how that knowledge was organized within Aksumite society. Who designed the complex? Who supervised its construction? Where did the stone come from? How many workers participated? How were they supplied? And what hierarchy existed within the building once it was completed? Archaeology can approach some of these questions through architectural analysis and material remains, but the social structure remains partly invisible. A palace is more than walls. It is an institution. People enter and leave. Officials record goods. Servants prepare food. Guards control access. Rulers receive visitors. Craft workers maintain buildings. Religious specialists perform rituals. Messages move between rooms. Decisions are made. Almost none of those moments survive directly. Instead, archaeologists find foundations and attempt to reconstruct the activities that once animated them. This is one reason Dungur is so valuable. The ruins provide a rare opportunity to study the physical environment of Aksumite elite life. And the site becomes even more intriguing when compared with the monumental tombs and stelae nearby. The stelae were not simply giant stones. They were statements of identity and authority. Some were carved to resemble multi-story buildings, complete with false doors and window patterns. Their scale demonstrates an extraordinary investment in stoneworking and monumental display. Dungur's architecture belongs to the same cultural environment. Perhaps the palace and the monumental stelae formed complementary expressions of power. One represented the living elite. The other commemorated the dead. One provided a space for political activity. The other transformed memory into stone. Yet, the exact relationship remains difficult to reconstruct. The Aksumite kingdom itself eventually entered a period of decline. Changes in regional trade, political structures, environmental conditions, and the growing importance of new centers may all have contributed. By the later 1st millennium AD, the political landscape of the Horn of Africa had changed significantly. Dungur was eventually abandoned or transformed. Its walls deteriorated. Parts of the structure were buried. Later inhabitants occupied the surrounding landscape. And centuries passed. The silence of the ruins can create the impression that the site was suddenly deserted. But abandonment is rarely so simple. Buildings may remain partially occupied. Rooms may be repurposed. Materials may be removed for new construction. Communities may gradually shift toward other areas. From the weathered foundations of Dungur, our journey now moves westward, into the misty uplands of County Clare, Ireland, where the landscape itself becomes the monument. On the summit of Seefin Mountain, nearly 400 meters above sea level, a circular mound of stones rests against the open sky, surrounded by rolling hills, bog, pasture, and distant horizons. This is Seefin Passage Tomb. At first glance, it can seem like little more than a rough stone cairn on a windswept summit. Yet, beneath that quiet exterior lies one of the most intriguing prehistoric monuments in the region. A passage tomb constructed thousands of years ago. Its central chamber reached through a narrow stone-lined passage. The builders belonged to Ireland's Neolithic communities, long before written records existed on the island. The monument is generally associated with the 4th millennium BC, placing its construction within a period when farming communities were transforming the Irish landscape and creating increasingly elaborate ceremonial and funerary monuments. But Seefin is not simply a burial mound. Its location is part of what makes it compelling. From the summit, the surrounding countryside opens in every direction. Mountains rise in the distance. Valleys stretch toward the horizon. Other prehistoric monuments occupy the wider landscape. Why place a monument here? The practical answer may be partly defensive or geographic visibility. A summit provides a dramatic landmark and allows a monument to be seen from considerable distances. But passage tombs were not generally designed as military structures. Their purpose was connected with death, ceremony, memory, and the relationship between communities and their landscapes. At Seefin, the architecture reinforces that connection. The monument consists of a circular cairn surrounding a central burial chamber, with a passage leading inward. The chamber itself was constructed from large stones, carefully arranged to create an enclosed space within the mound. This basic design appears elsewhere in Ireland. Passage tombs are part of a broader prehistoric tradition that includes famous monuments such as Newgrange, Knowth, and Douth in County Meath. Those monuments demonstrate that Neolithic communities possess sophisticated knowledge of stone construction, landscape organization, and celestial observation. Seefin is smaller and less elaborate, yet its simplicity can make it more difficult to interpret. There are no surviving written records explaining the rituals performed here. No inscription identifies the people buried inside. No contemporary account describes the ceremonies. The stones remain, but the cultural system that gave them meaning has largely disappeared. Archaeologists have found evidence that passage tombs could contain human remains and objects associated with burial rituals. But these monuments were not necessarily used as ordinary graves in the modern sense. Some may have been places where human remains were deposited, rearranged, revisited, or incorporated into ceremonial practices over generations. Death was not necessarily a single event. The monument could become a place of repeated interaction between the living and the dead. Could Seefin have served such a purpose? It is possible. The chamber may have been reopened repeatedly. Human remains may have been placed inside at different times. Ceremonies could have taken place around the mound, linking generations of the living with their ancestors. Yet, the evidence is incomplete. The passage itself is especially intriguing. To enter the monument, one must move from the open landscape into a confined corridor of stone. The experience changes immediately. Outside, the summit is exposed to wind and sky. Inside, the passage narrows. Light decreases. The surrounding landscape disappears. Eventually, the chamber is reached. This movement from openness to enclosure may have carried symbolic significance. Many prehistoric monuments use architectural transitions in ways that appear deliberate. Narrow entrances, enclosed chambers, circular spaces, and carefully selected orientations could shape how people experienced ritual movement. But symbolism cannot be assumed simply because a structure feels dramatic to modern visitors. The builders may have had practical reasons for the design, or the practical and symbolic purposes may have been inseparable. For Neolithic communities, architecture was not necessarily divided into categories such as engineering, religion, and landscape planning. A monument could function as all three. The summit itself adds another question. Seefin is one of several prehistoric monuments situated in elevated landscapes across Ireland. Mountains and hills often served as prominent locations for cairns, stone circles, standing stones, and other monuments. Were these locations chosen because they were visually dominant? Because they marked territories? Because they had spiritual significance? Or because they provided direct relationships with the sun, moon, and seasonal cycles? Perhaps several factors influence the choice. This possibility becomes especially interesting when considering the wider Irish passage tomb tradition. Newgrange is famously aligned with the winter solstice sunrise, allowing sunlight to enter its passage and illuminate the inner chamber for a short period each year. Other passage tombs demonstrate astronomical or landscape orientations as well. Seefin's precise astronomical significance is less certain. Its position and orientation have encouraged speculation about relationships with the sun or other celestial events, but claims of highly specific astronomical functions require careful evidence. The danger is clear. Once a prehistoric monument is associated with astronomy, almost any alignment can begin to look intentional. Mountains, valleys, sunrise points, and distant landmarks can produce numerous possible patterns. To establish a genuine astronomical alignment, researchers need measurable relationships that are statistically meaningful and consistent with the architectural evidence. At Seefin, some questions remain open. That does not make the monument less remarkable. In fact, uncertainty is part of what makes it valuable. The stones preserve the decisions of people who had no written language, at least none that has survived. Their construction required collective effort. Large stones had to be selected, transported, positioned, and stabilized. The mound itself required substantial quantities of material. People had to organize labor and maintain the monument. This implies a degree of social cooperation that is easy to underestimate. The Neolithic communities of Ireland were farmers, but they were also builders, planners, and participants in complex ceremonial traditions. Seefin demonstrates that their relationship with the landscape extended beyond agriculture. The summit was transformed into a place of memory. The monument would have been visible from surrounding areas, perhaps becoming a landmark shared by communities living across the region. And that visibility may have mattered. A monument on a summit can define a landscape. It can mark a place where people gather. It can establish a connection between ancestors and territory. It can tell neighboring communities that a particular group has invested labor and meaning into this location. Perhaps Seefin was therefore not only about the dead, it may also have been about the living. Who had the right to perform ceremonies there? Who maintained the cairn? Who was permitted to enter the chamber? Were all members of the community treated equally in death, or were particular individuals given special status? These questions are difficult to answer because the archaeological record rarely preserves social identities clearly. Human remains can reveal age, sex, health, and sometimes diet or mobility. Artifacts can suggest status or cultural connections, but the emotional and social relationships between individuals are much harder to reconstruct. This creates a subtle tension at Seefin. The monument is enormous compared with the tiny amount of information it gives us about the people who created it. The architecture survived. The names did not. The rituals disappeared. The stone remained. Over centuries, weather altered the cairn. Stones were displaced. Vegetation colonized the mound. The original appearance became increasingly difficult to reconstruct. And yet, the essential structure survived. Today, standing on Seefin Mountain, the monument remains exposed to the same broad sky that its builders once observed. The surrounding landscape has changed dramatically. Modern roads, farms, settlements, and infrastructure have altered the view. But the mountains and valleys remain. That continuity is powerful. A person standing at the monument today occupies the same physical summit where people stood thousands of years ago. They may have looked toward the same distant hills. They may have watched the same sun move across the sky. They may have gathered around the cairn during ceremonies whose details are now lost. This does not mean the experience was identical, but the physical setting creates a rare connection between present and prehistoric time. There are also legends associated with Irish mountains and ancient monuments, and Seefin has sometimes been interpreted through the broader tradition of Celtic mythology. Such traditions can enrich the cultural landscape, but they should not automatically be projected backward onto a monument built thousands of years before the historical Celtic period. The Neolithic builders of Seefin belonged to a much earlier world. Their beliefs cannot be assumed from later mythology. That distinction is important. The mystery of Seefin becomes more compelling when the evidence is allowed to remain incomplete. We know the monument is prehistoric. From the windswept summit of Seefin, our journey now follows the ancient landscape toward the Atlantic coast of Brittany, France, where another prehistoric monument rises above the surrounding countryside. On the rugged peninsula of Pluiseaux, overlooking the Bay of Morlaix, a long, stone-covered ridge stretches across the hilltop. This is the Cairn of Barnenez. At first glance, it resembles a low, elongated mound of pale stones, weathered by centuries of Atlantic wind. But beneath that massive covering lies something far more intricate, a complex of multiple prehistoric passage tombs built and modified over generations more than 6,000 years ago. Barnenez is among the oldest monumental structures in Europe. Its earliest construction dates to approximately 4,500 BC, while later additions were made centuries afterward. That chronology places its beginnings thousands of years before the Egyptian pyramids and long before the monumental stone architecture of classical Greece or Rome. Yet, Barnenez was not created in a single episode. The monument grew. Its builders constructed one group of chambers and passages, then later expanded the complex with additional structures. The result is a massive cairn containing 11 burial chambers, connected by passages and concealed beneath an enormous covering of stone and earth. From the outside, the individual chambers are almost impossible to see. The interior tells another story. Inside, narrow corridors lead into carefully constructed chambers made from enormous slabs of stone. Some chambers contain carved symbols, arcs, spirals, geometric forms, and patterns whose meanings remain uncertain. The contrast is striking. From the surrounding landscape, Barnenez appears solid and silent. Inside, the monument becomes a network of enclosed spaces. And that transition raises an important question. Why invest such extraordinary effort in creating rooms that would spend most of their existence in darkness? The conventional archaeological interpretation is that Barnenez was primarily a funerary and ceremonial monument. Human remains and archaeological material associated with prehistoric burial traditions indicate that the chambers were connected with the treatment and remembrance of the dead. But passage tombs were rarely simple graves. Across Atlantic Europe, Neolithic communities constructed elaborate monuments in which burial, ritual, ancestry, and landscape appear to have been closely connected. The dead may have been placed inside chambers that were revisited over long periods. Ceremonies may have taken place near the entrances. Objects could have been deposited as offerings. The monument itself may have acted as a permanent statement about community identity. Barnenez fits within this wider tradition, but its scale makes it exceptional. The amount of stone required is enormous. Estimates of the monument's volume vary depending on reconstruction, but it clearly represents a substantial collective undertaking. Thousands of stones had to be quarried, transported, positioned, and arranged. The builders possessed no metal machinery. No wheeled construction vehicles existed. There were no modern cranes. Yet, they created a structure more than 70 meters long, containing 11 chambers and multiple internal passages. How was such a project organized? The answer may lie in the nature of Neolithic society itself. Agricultural communities could mobilize labor during periods when farming demands were lower. Groups could cooperate in transporting stones, preparing construction areas, and maintaining ceremonial sites. The work would have required planning, leadership, food supplies, and knowledge of local geology. Barnenez therefore tells us something important about the people who built it. They were not simply farmers constructing a convenient burial place. They were capable of coordinating large-scale projects over extended periods. The monument also reveals an intimate knowledge of stone. Different types of rock were used in its construction, including granite blocks brought from nearby sources. The builders selected slabs according to size, shape, and function, arranging them to create stable chambers and passages. Some of the interior stones are decorated. These carvings are among the most intriguing elements at Barnenez. Certain surfaces display repeated geometric motifs, including curved lines, spirals, and patterns sometimes interpreted as axes, bows, or abstract symbols. Their exact meanings remain uncertain. This is where the monument begins to resist easy interpretation. A carved spiral appears simple, but what did it represent to the person who carved it? Was it connected with movement? Water? The cycles of life, the sun? A particular myth? Or was it simply a symbol whose significance depended upon a cultural system that no longer survives? There is no written explanation. No Neolithic inscription translates the imagery for us. The symbols have to speak through comparison, context, and careful archaeological analysis. Some researchers have identified possible parallels between the carvings at Barnenez and symbolic traditions found elsewhere in Atlantic Europe. That does not necessarily mean the communities shared a single religion or political system. Ideas can travel. People migrate. Objects move. Symbols can be reinvented. And similar motifs can also emerge independently. The presence of similar spirals or geometric forms therefore does not automatically prove direct contact. Still, the distribution of prehistoric monuments along the Atlantic facade is remarkable. From Brittany to Ireland and Britain, communities created passage tombs, megalithic chambers, standing stones, and ceremonial landscapes. The similarities suggest that Neolithic Europe was connected by networks of cultural exchange far more extensive than earlier generations sometimes assumed. Barnenez belongs to that world. but it also appears to have developed its own architectural identity. The monument was constructed in two principal phases, with the later addition creating a much larger and more complex structure. The builders did not simply reproduce the first design, they expanded it. This raises another question. Why did later communities return to the same location? Perhaps the original monument had already become sacred. Perhaps the ancestors associated with it had acquired greater importance over generations. Perhaps the site represented a territorial claim. Or perhaps the location itself held significance because of its relationship with the surrounding landscape. The position of Barnenez is particularly revealing. The monument occupies a prominent hill overlooking the Bay of Morlaix. From its elevated position, the surrounding coastline and countryside open into a broad panorama. The sea would have been visible. The changing weather would have been visible. Sunrise and sunset would have transformed the appearance of the landscape. For Neolithic communities living close to the Atlantic coast, the sea was not merely scenery. It was a route of movement, a source of food, a boundary, and perhaps a spiritual presence. Could the placement of Barnenez have connected the dead with this larger landscape? Possibly. But again, archaeology cannot provide a single definitive explanation. Some interpretations emphasize burial. Others focus on ritual gatherings. Some researchers see passage tombs as monuments connected with ancestors and social memory. Others have proposed that their chambers may have played roles in ceremonies involving light, sound, movement, or restricted access. These ideas are plausible, but evidence varies from site to site. The interior architecture itself suggests controlled movement. Visitors could not simply walk directly into the chambers. They had to enter through narrow passages. The experience would have changed gradually. Light from the outside would diminish. The sound of footsteps would become amplified by stone walls. The chamber would become increasingly enclosed. For prehistoric participants, this may have created a powerful sensory environment. But it is important not to project modern psychological assumptions onto people who lived thousands of years ago. We cannot know precisely what they felt. We can only observe what they built. And what they built required extraordinary effort. Barnenez is especially significant because it survived almost by accident. For centuries, the cairn remained part of the landscape. Then, in the 20th century, its survival came close to being threatened. Before archaeological investigations recognized its importance, parts of the monument were treated as a convenient source of stone. Quarrying damaged portions of the structure, removing material that had survived for millennia. Eventually, its archaeological value was recognized and systematic investigation began. This episode adds another layer to the story. A monument created around 4500 BC nearly disappeared in the modern era not through natural erosion, but through human misunderstanding. What survived was enough to reveal its extraordinary complexity. Archaeologists discovered multiple chambers and passages beneath the cairn, along with decorated stones and evidence of repeated construction. The site became a crucial source of information about Neolithic architecture in Western Europe. And yet, even after decades of study, fundamental questions remain. Who exactly built the earliest chamber? How many generations participated? Were the 11 chambers used simultaneously? Were all of them funerary? Why were certain stones decorated while others were left plain? And what did the symbols mean? There are also questions about the social organization behind the monument. From the Atlantic winds of Barnenez, the journey now moves south and east into the luminous Mediterranean, where the sea surrounds an island whose ancient landscape preserves another architectural puzzle. On the western coast of Corfu, near the modern city of Kerkira, the ruins of the Temple of Kardaki occupy a quiet position above the water. Today, only fragments of its foundations remain, surrounded by vegetation and the steep contours of the hillside. Yet, more than 2,500 years ago, this was the setting for a Greek sanctuary, whose architecture has continued to provoke debate. This is the Temple of Kardaki. The ruins are modest compared with the monumental temples of Athens, Sicily, or southern Italy. There are no towering columns standing intact against the sky. No complete roof survives. No inscription clearly identifies the deity worshipped here. And that absence is precisely what makes Kardaki so intriguing. The temple dates to the early 6th century BC, making it one of the important early examples of Greek Doric architecture in the Western Greek world. Its construction belongs to a period when Greek communities were experimenting with monumental stone temples, transforming earlier traditions of wooden and mud brick architecture into increasingly permanent forms. Yet, Kardaki does not fit comfortably into every expectation of what a Doric temple should look like. The temple was discovered in 1822, during excavations associated with the British administration of Corfu. Archaeologists encountered the remains on the slope near the sea, and the structure quickly attracted attention because of its unusual architectural characteristics. Its plan was relatively compact. The building possessed a columned exterior and a central chamber, or cella, but several features distinguish it from later, more standardized Doric temples. Most notably, Kardaki appears to lack the conventional arrangement of triglyphs and metopes normally associated with the Doric frieze. That detail may sound technical, but it matters. The Doric order eventually became one of the most recognizable architectural systems of the ancient Mediterranean. Columns with plain capitals, heavy horizontal entablatures, alternating triglyphs and metopes, and carefully proportioned facades became part of a visual language repeated across centuries. Kardaki belongs to the period when that language was still developing. Perhaps the temple's unusual appearance is therefore not evidence of a lost architectural tradition at all. Perhaps it is evidence of experimentation. The builders were working within an emerging architectural system, but the rules had not yet become rigid. This is one of the most reasonable explanations for the temple's peculiarities. Architecture evolves through experimentation. Early builders borrow forms, modify them, and sometimes abandon features that later generations consider essential. Kardaki may preserve one of those transitional moments. But another question remains much harder to answer. Who was the temple built for? The identity of its deity is uncertain. Different interpretations have connected the sanctuary with several Greek gods, including Apollo, Artemis, and Hera. None of these identifications can be regarded as absolutely secure. Without a surviving inscription naming the deity, archaeologists must examine the architecture, location, associated finds, and wider religious landscape of ancient Corfu. That leaves room for interpretation. Corfu, known in antiquity as Kerkyra, occupied a strategically important position in the Ionian Sea. The island stood along maritime routes connecting the Greek mainland, southern Italy, and the wider Adriatic region. Its location encouraged trade, it encouraged colonization, and it encouraged cultural exchange. Corfu was one of the earliest Greek colonies in the western Mediterranean, traditionally associated with Corinthian expansion during the 8th century BC. By the 6th century BC, the island had developed its own political and religious identity. The Temple of Kardaki belonged to that evolving world. Its position overlooking the sea may have been significant. Ancient sanctuaries were often placed in locations that connected religious activity with prominent natural features. Springs, caves, mountains, coastlines, and elevated points could all acquire sacred significance. Kardaki is particularly interesting because a natural spring is associated with the area. Water was deeply important in Greek religious practice. Springs could become sacred places. They could be associated with purification, healing, fertility, or particular deities. The relationship between the temple and the spring has therefore encouraged interpretations that the sanctuary may have had a connection with water-related ritual activity. But once again, the evidence does not provide a final answer. A spring near a temple does not automatically identify the god worshipped there. It does, however, offer a clue. Perhaps worshippers came to the site not simply to enter a temple, but to interact with the sacred landscape in which architecture and natural water were connected. This possibility places Kardaki within a broader pattern visible throughout the ancient Greek world. A sanctuary was rarely just a building. It could include an altar, sacred trees, springs, pathways, terraces, storage rooms, and spaces where offerings were deposited. The temple itself might house the cult image, while much of the ritual activity occurred outside. That distinction is important when looking at the ruins today. The surviving foundations represent only one part of the ancient religious environment. The altar may have stood nearby. Offerings may have accumulated around the sanctuary. Pilgrims may have approached along routes that have since disappeared beneath later development and vegetation. The sounds of ritual, conversation, music, and animals would have transformed the site. None of this survives directly. Only traces remain. And Kardaki contains another intriguing detail. Its architecture appears unusually refined in some respects despite belonging to a relatively early stage of Doric development. The columns and proportions suggest that its builders possessed considerable knowledge of monumental construction. They were not simply copying a standard model, they were adapting architectural ideas to local circumstances. This raises a broader question about the development of Greek architecture. Where did these early forms come from? The traditional answer points toward a gradual evolution from earlier Greek building traditions, especially those using timber. Features that had practical functions in wooden architecture could eventually become formalized in stone. The triglyph, for example, has often been discussed in relation to the visual memory of timber construction. But architectural development was not isolated from the wider Mediterranean. Greek communities interacted with Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and other regions where monumental architecture had much older histories. Ideas traveled with merchants, craftsmen, travelers, and colonists. The result was not simple imitation. Greek builders selectively incorporated and transformed external influences. Kardaki may therefore represent one stage in that larger process of architectural experimentation. More speculative interpretations sometimes take the temple's unusual characteristics as evidence of an entirely separate architectural tradition or an unexplained technology. There is no strong archaeological basis for such claims. The construction methods are compatible with ancient Greek building practices. The more interesting mystery lies elsewhere. Why did the builders choose this particular design? Was it a local Corfeo tradition, a Corinthian influence, a deliberate religious choice, or simply an early form of Doric architecture that had not yet developed the standardized features seen in later centuries? The surviving evidence cannot fully settle the question. Even the temple's date has required careful interpretation. Early 6th century BC architecture existed during a period of rapid transformation. Greek cities were becoming more politically organized, sanctuaries were receiving increasing investment, and monumental stone construction was spreading throughout the Mediterranean. Temples became expressions of civic identity. They demonstrated wealth. They honored deities. They created places for communal ceremonies, and they could also communicate the status of the community that built them. Kardaki may therefore have been more than a religious building. It may have represented Corfu's participation in a broader cultural transformation. A community that could construct a monumental stone temple was demonstrating organizational capacity. Quarries had to be identified. Stone had to be extracted. Blocks had to be transported. Craftsmen had to shape columns and architectural elements. Workers had to assemble them according to a coherent plan. All of this required resources and coordination. Yet the temple itself is relatively small. Perhaps that was intentional. Monumentality does not always depend on size. A carefully proportioned structure in a prominent location can carry enormous symbolic weight. The sanctuary's coastal position may also have connected it with travelers arriving by sea. A temple overlooking a maritime route could serve as a religious landmark for sailors and merchants. Was the sanctuary visible from approaching vessels? Possibly. Could travelers have recognized it as they approached Corfu? Perhaps. But these possibilities remain difficult to demonstrate archaeologically. The ancient shoreline may not have looked exactly as it does today, and vegetation and later construction have altered the visual environment. From the windswept ruins of Kardaki, our journey now moves westward across the Mediterranean to the island of Majorca, where fields of pale stone and dry grass conceal the remains of a settlement built by a society whose monuments still dominate the Balearic landscape. Near the town of Montuiri, in the heart of Majorca, low hills rise above the surrounding agricultural plains. Here, among olive trees and open fields, stand the massive stone structures of Fornés. At first, the settlement appears almost austere. There are no towering temples covered with inscriptions, no monumental statues announcing the names of rulers. Instead, broad stone walls form circular buildings, narrow passages, defensive structures, and carefully arranged domestic spaces. Yet, Fornés was once a substantial community. Its origins reach back to the Talayotic period of the Balearic Islands, beginning around the 9th century BC, although occupation of the area continued and changed over many centuries. The settlement became part of a wider cultural landscape that included Majorca and Menorca, where prehistoric communities constructed enormous stone towers known as talayots. These structures are among the defining monuments of the islands. Their exact purpose remains debated. Some appear to have served defensive functions. Others may have been gathering places, elite residences, storage facilities, or spaces associated with ritual activity. At Fornés, 3 major talayots survive within the settlement, accompanied by houses and other structures. The largest is particularly imposing. Built from enormous limestone blocks, it rises above the surrounding ruins as though designed to dominate the settlement visually. Standing beside it today, it is easy to see why these structures have generated so much speculation. How could communities without modern machinery move such heavy stones? Why build enormous towers within settlements that were already protected by walls? And what happened inside them? The archaeological evidence offers several possibilities, but no single interpretation explains every talayot. One important point is that the word talayot describes a type of structure rather than a confirmed function. The ancient builders left no written manual explaining their architecture. The term itself comes from a later language and was applied to these prehistoric towers because of their appearance. So, when we call a structure a talayot, we are identifying its architectural form, not necessarily understanding its original purpose. That distinction becomes essential at Fornés. The settlement developed over a long period, and its buildings changed as society changed. Archaeological excavations have revealed domestic areas containing hearths, grinding stones, pottery, storage vessels, and other evidence of everyday life. These remains provide a glimpse into a community that farmed, processed food, manufactured objects, and participated in wider networks of exchange. This is where Fornés becomes especially valuable. The settlement was not simply a collection of monumental stones. It was a place where people lived. Families prepared meals. Grain was processed. Animals were managed. Tools were produced. Goods were stored. People gathered within enclosed spaces. The enormous architecture existed alongside ordinary human activity. That contrast is striking. A massive Talayote could dominate the settlement, while only a few meters away, archaeologists find evidence of mundane domestic life. Perhaps this suggests that monumental architecture was integrated into everyday society rather than existing separately from it. But why? One possibility is social organization. Large communal structures require labor. Someone had to coordinate construction. Someone had to determine where stones were placed. Someone had to organize food and resources for workers. This suggests that Talayotic communities possessed systems of leadership and cooperation more complex than the image of isolated prehistoric farmers might imply. The Talayotes may have been expressions of collective identity. They could have marked important spaces within settlements. They may also have represented the authority of particular groups. Yet there is another possibility. Their enormous size may have had symbolic significance independent of practical function. A structure does not need to house large numbers of people to communicate power. Its visibility alone can matter. The largest Talayote at Fornés would have been difficult to ignore. It stood above the settlement, turning stone into a permanent landmark. Could it have been a meeting place, a ceremonial center, a symbol of communal unity, or a structure controlled by an elite group? Archaeologists have debated these possibilities for decades. Evidence from other Talayotic sites suggests that functions varied considerably. Some towers were located within settlements. Others stood in positions that appear more isolated. Some contain internal chambers. Others are more difficult to enter. Their construction dates also vary. This diversity makes it unlikely that every Talayote served exactly the same purpose. Fornés may therefore represent one local interpretation of a much broader architectural tradition. The settlement itself contains another intriguing feature: its defensive organization. Walls and controlled entrances indicate that boundaries mattered, but defense is not necessarily the only explanation. A wall can separate spaces, it can regulate movement, it can define communal territory, it can also create a sense of identity. In a prehistoric settlement, entering through a restricted opening may have marked a transition from the surrounding landscape into a social world. Who was allowed inside? Who controlled access? Were visitors welcomed freely? Or did certain areas belong only to particular families or ritual specialists? The stones cannot answer directly, but the architecture can reveal patterns of movement. Archaeologists can examine entrances, pathways, visibility, and the relationship between buildings to reconstruct how people may have navigated the settlement. At Fornés, domestic structures are arranged around open spaces, creating a sense of organized community rather than random occupation. That arrangement raises questions about social relationships. Were houses occupied by extended families? Did different groups share common work areas? Were some buildings reserved for communal activities? And did the Talayotes function as centers around which these social relationships were organized? The answers remain incomplete. The Talayotic period itself was not static. Majorca experienced cultural and economic changes over many centuries. Communities interacted with neighboring islands and Mediterranean peoples. Trade introduced new materials and ideas. By the later first millennium BC, external influences became increasingly visible. Phoenician and Punic networks expanded across the western Mediterranean. Greek and later Roman influence reached the islands. The Talayotic world eventually became incorporated into the Roman sphere. This transition matters because Fornés was not frozen in time. The settlement continued to evolve. Structures were altered. Objects changed. Economic practices shifted. New cultural influences appeared. Eventually, the settlement ceased to function as it once had, but the reasons for its transformation are complex. Political changes may have played a role. Economic networks changed. New technologies and cultural practices arrived. The arrival of Rome transformed the political organization of Majorca. Yet, local traditions did not simply disappear overnight. Cultural change is usually gradual. People can adopt new practices while retaining older ones. A Roman-era object may appear beside an older indigenous tradition. A settlement may change function before it is finally abandoned. The archaeological layers at Fornés preserve parts of this long transformation. This makes the site valuable not only for understanding the Talayotic period, but also for observing how prehistoric island communities responded to a changing Mediterranean world. And then there is the question of ritual. Evidence from Fornés and other Talayotic settlements has led researchers to investigate feasting, communal gatherings, animal use, and ritual activity. Certain objects and architectural arrangements may indicate ceremonies, but interpretation remains cautious. A large room could have hosted a gathering. A concentration of animal remains could represent ordinary consumption or ritual feasting. A carefully positioned object could have symbolic importance or simply reflect practical use. The difficulty is that ritual leaves ambiguous traces. Unlike written religious texts, archaeological evidence rarely explains itself. This ambiguity has encouraged more speculative theories. Some popular interpretations portray the Talayots as astronomical observatories, sacred towers, or structures designed according to sophisticated celestial calculations. There are certainly prehistoric monuments whose orientation appears connected to astronomical events, but there is no compelling evidence that every Talayot was built primarily as an observatory. The simplest explanation may sometimes be the strongest. Communities built large towers because the structures served social, defensive, ceremonial, or architectural purposes within their own cultural system. Still, the possibility of astronomical knowledge should not be dismissed entirely. Prehistoric farmers had practical reasons to observe the sky. The changing position of the sun marked seasons. The moon provided another natural cycle. Stars could assist navigation. Agricultural communities needed reliable ways to understand time. Whether Fornés encoded such knowledge in its architecture remains uncertain. From the great stone towers of Fornés, our journey now leaves the islands and returns to mainland Europe, toward the rolling landscape of Portugal's Alentejo, where one of Iberia's most imposing prehistoric monuments rises from fields of cork oak, olive, and dry grass. Near Évora, the dolmen of Anta Grande do Zambujeiro stands as a monumental arrangement of enormous granite slabs. Several stones lean against one another, forming the remains of a chamber that was once enclosed by an earthen and stone mound. Even in its damaged condition, the scale is immediately apparent. This was not an ordinary grave. Anta Grande do Zambujeiro belongs to the megalithic traditions of prehistoric Portugal and is generally dated to the 4th millennium BC, although its precise chronology and phases of use remain subjects of archaeological discussion. It was constructed by communities living thousands of years before the emergence of written records in the region. The people who built it left no inscription explaining their intentions. There are no carved names identifying the individuals commemorated here. No surviving text describes the ceremonies that took place inside. Instead, there are stones, massive stones, carefully selected and transported into position. And those stones preserve an extraordinary record of prehistoric engineering. The monument is a passage grave, or dolmen, consisting of a large chamber formed by upright slabs supporting massive capstones. A passage once provided access to the interior, connecting the enclosed chamber with the surrounding landscape. From the outside, the structure may appear almost skeletal today, but its original appearance would have been very different. The chamber and passage were likely covered by a mound, creating an enclosed architectural space that separated the interior from the open countryside. That transformation, from open landscape to enclosed chamber, was common in many megalithic monuments. But why? The conventional explanation is funerary. Human remains have been associated with Portuguese megalithic monuments, and Anta Grande do Zambujeiro is generally interpreted as a collective burial monument. Yet the word tomb can sometimes oversimplify what these places meant. A prehistoric burial monument could have served several purposes simultaneously. It could contain human remains. It could commemorate ancestors. It could provide a location for repeated ceremonies. It could define the territory of a community. It could become a place where the living interacted symbolically with generations who had come before them. Perhaps Anta Grande do Zambujeiro was all of these things. The monument's scale makes that possibility especially compelling. Some of its granite slabs are enormous. Their weight would have required careful planning and coordinated labor. The builders had no iron tools, no mechanical lifting equipment, and no modern transport systems. Yet, they were able to move stones across the landscape and raise them into a stable architectural arrangement. Exactly how they accomplished this remains an area of archaeological interest. The basic techniques are not impossible to reconstruct. Wooden rollers, sledges, ropes, levers, prepared tracks, and large teams of workers could have been used. Experiments with prehistoric construction have demonstrated that substantial stones can be moved with relatively simple technologies when enough labor and planning are available. The mystery, therefore, does not require an unknown technology. The more revealing question is why communities were willing to invest such effort. Moving one enormous stone is difficult. Moving many stones, positioning them accurately, constructing a chamber, and then covering the structure with a mound represents a far greater social undertaking. It implies cooperation. It implies organization. And perhaps it implies a shared belief strong enough to motivate people to spend valuable time and resources on a monument that did not directly produce food. That alone tells us something about prehistoric society. These communities were not concerned only with survival in the narrowest sense. They invested in memory. They invested in ritual. They invested in places that could endure beyond individual lifetimes. Anta Grande do Zambujeiro may therefore be understood as a monument to collective identity as much as a place of burial. Its location is also significant. The Alentejo contains an extraordinary concentration of prehistoric monuments, including dolmens, menhirs, stone circles, and other megalithic structures. This was not an isolated phenomenon. Communities across the region were transforming the landscape with monumental stone architecture during the Neolithic and Copper Age. The landscape itself became a kind of cultural map. Certain hills, valleys, springs, and open plains acquired monuments that marked them permanently. A dolmen could be visible from a considerable distance. It could become a landmark for people moving through the countryside. It could identify a territory. It could connect a community with ancestors associated with a particular place. At Anta Grande do Zambujeiro, that relationship between monument and landscape is difficult to ignore. The granite slabs rise from the surrounding vegetation like fragments of an enormous structure whose original proportions are now only partially visible. For the people who built it, however, the monument may have been completely different. The mound would have concealed the stone chamber. The passage would have created a controlled route into the interior. The chamber would have been darker and more enclosed. The experience of entering it may have been carefully structured. Light from outside would gradually disappear. The sound of movement would change as people entered the confined passage. Inside, the massive stones would surround participants on every side. Could this have been deliberate? Possibly. Architecture can shape human experience. A narrow passage naturally slows movement. An enclosed chamber restricts visibility. A large capstone creates a sense of weight and permanence. Even without written instructions, the structure itself could communicate that the visitor had entered a different kind of space. Some more speculative interpretations have proposed that megalithic chambers were designed around astronomical observations or specific solar orientations. There is evidence that certain prehistoric monuments in Iberia and elsewhere were deliberately aligned with celestial events. But such claims must be approached carefully. Not every orientation is astronomical. The position of a monument can be influenced by terrain, visibility, geology, access routes, or social considerations. For Anta Grande do Zambujeiro, the safest interpretation remains connected with funerary and ceremonial activity. Still, the possibility that the builders incorporated observations of the sun or seasonal cycles cannot simply be excluded without examining the monument's orientation and broader landscape context. Prehistoric farming communities had practical reasons to understand seasonal change. The annual movement of the sun affected agriculture. Rainfall and temperature influenced planting and harvesting. The night sky provided a reliable framework for marking time. Whether those observations became embedded in the architecture of this monument is another matter. The interior may contain another clue in its construction. The use of large granite slabs reflects the geology of the surrounding region. The builders were not importing exotic stone from distant mountains when suitable material was available locally. That may seem obvious, but it reveals something important about prehistoric engineering. Monument builders worked with the landscape they inhabited. They knew where suitable stones could be found. They understood their physical properties. They selected slabs large enough to serve specific structural functions. They transformed naturally occurring geological material into architecture. In this sense, the monument represents a collaboration between human intention and the physical landscape. The granite already existed. The builders gave it a new arrangement and meaning. But the monument did not remain unchanged. Like many prehistoric structures, Anta Grande do Zambujeiro experienced disturbance over thousands of years. Stone was displaced. The mound deteriorated. Later, human activity affected the remains. Modern archaeological investigations have also changed our understanding of the site. Excavation is itself a form of reconstruction. Researchers remove layers of soil, document stone positions, analyze artifacts, and attempt to determine how the monument developed. But every excavation also removes part of the archaeological context. That is why documentation is so important. A stone lying outside the chamber today may once have belonged to a particular section of the monument. A fragment of pottery may indicate a specific phase of use. A human bone may provide information about age, diet, mobility, or chronology. Piece by piece, archaeologists attempt to rebuild a story from incomplete evidence. Yet there are limits. We cannot recover the voices of the people who entered the chamber. We cannot know the exact words spoken during ceremonies. We cannot identify every person who contributed to the construction, and we cannot determine with certainty how later generations interpreted the monument. Perhaps the meaning changed over time. A structure built as a burial monument could later become an ancestral shrine. From the monumental stones of Anta Grande do Zambujeiro, our journey now crosses the Atlantic and reaches the rugged valleys of northwestern Argentina, where mountains, dry forests, and highland plains surround the remains of a settlement that endured for centuries. In the Calchaquí Valley of Tucumán province, the Quilmes Ruins spread across the lower slopes of the mountains. Stone walls follow the contours of the terrain, while terraces, courtyards, and foundations appear among the scrub and pale earth. Above them, the Andes rise toward the horizon. This is Quilmes. The settlement was home to the Quilmes people, an indigenous community whose history extends deep into the pre-Columbian period. Archaeological evidence indicates that the site developed over many centuries, reaching considerable size before the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century. Today, the ruins appear silent, but they were once part of a living society. Families occupied houses, people cultivated crops, animals were raised, food was prepared and stored. Communities moved through narrow pathways between stone structures. Ceremonies were performed. Trade and political relationships connected Quilmes with neighboring communities throughout the Calchaquí region. What survives is therefore not simply a collection of walls. It is the physical remains of a complex society adapting to one of the most demanding environments in South America. The valley is dry. Rainfall is limited. Summer storms can be intense, while much of the year remains arid. Water, therefore, mattered enormously. The people of Quilmes developed agricultural terraces and irrigation systems that allowed them to cultivate crops in an environment where ordinary farming would have been difficult. Stone terraces climbed portions of the slopes. Channels directed water. Fields were carefully organized. This agricultural landscape reveals an important principle. The settlement was not simply placed in the mountains, it was engineered into them. The terrain itself became part of the community's infrastructure. That raises the first important question. Why build such an extensive settlement here? The answer may be found in geography. The Calchaquí Valley offered defensible positions, access to agricultural land, and connections between different regions of the Andes. The settlement's elevated location could provide visibility over surrounding approaches. At the same time, its terraces created productive land. Quilmes therefore appears to have combined several advantages: agriculture, access to water, strategic visibility, and protection offered by the surrounding terrain. Its architecture reinforces this interpretation. Many structures were built from local stone, with thick walls and relatively small openings. Some areas contain circular or rectangular foundations. Others consist of larger communal spaces. The organization was not random. Paths and walls created a structured settlement in which movement could be controlled. From certain elevated areas, the surrounding valley can be observed over considerable distances. That visibility may have had practical value. A community living in a politically competitive region would benefit from knowing who was approaching. But defensive architecture can also have social meaning. Walls do not merely stop people. They define spaces. They separate inside from outside. They establish boundaries between households, communal areas, agricultural zones, and exposed terrain. At Quilmes, the distinction between settlement and landscape appears especially strong. The buildings seem to emerge directly from the mountainside. Stone and earth blend together. From a distance, the settlement can almost disappear into the terrain. That quality may have been useful. A settlement that was difficult to identify from a distance would be harder to approach unnoticed. The Quilmes people eventually became known for their resistance to Spanish expansion. But that resistance belongs to a much later period than the earliest development of the settlement. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Spanish forces were attempting to establish control over the Calchaquí region. The indigenous communities of the valleys resisted for decades. The conflict was prolonged and severe. The Quilmes were among the groups that resisted Spanish domination, participating in what historians call the Calchaquí Wars. This history gives the ruins a particularly powerful dimension. The walls were not merely prehistoric architecture. They became part of a landscape in which political independence and survival were fiercely contested. The final defeat of the Quilmes came in the 17th century. After prolonged resistance, many survivors were forcibly displaced from their homeland. Large numbers were removed from the Calchaquí Valley and transported hundreds of kilometers south toward Buenos Aires. The forced relocation profoundly disrupted the community. The settlement that had endured for generations was no longer occupied in the same way. This later history is documented far more clearly than the earlier origins of the site, and that contrast creates an important archaeological problem. We know that the settlement existed before European arrival. We know that the Quilmes people lived there. We know that agriculture and irrigation were important. We know that the settlement had strategic characteristics, but the precise social organization of the earlier community is more difficult to reconstruct. Who controlled the terraces? Were agricultural lands shared? Did particular families dominate specific areas? Were there hereditary leaders? How were decisions made? Archaeology can provide clues, but it cannot reproduce the political conversations that once took place inside these walls. One of the most fascinating aspects of Quilmes is the relationship between ordinary domestic life and monumental defense. The settlement was not constructed as a single fortress. It was a living town. Homes, storage spaces, agricultural systems, and communal areas existed alongside defensive positions. This suggests that security was integrated into everyday life. People did not simply retreat into a fort during moments of danger. Their entire settlement was adapted to the possibility of conflict. That pattern is visible elsewhere in the Andes. Communities sometimes occupied elevated locations where steep slopes provided natural protection. Architecture reinforced the terrain. Walls closed gaps. Terraces stabilized slopes. Pathways were narrowed. The result was a settlement that could be both productive and defensible. Some modern interpretations have gone further, suggesting that Quilmes was designed as an almost impregnable mountain fortress. That description captures part of its character but risks oversimplifying the site. The settlement's primary purpose was not necessarily military. People lived there, they farmed there, they raised families there. They performed everyday tasks there. Defense was one element of a larger social system. Another intriguing feature is the settlement's relationship with the surrounding mountains. The Calchaquí landscape is visually dramatic. High ridges surround the valley. Dry slopes rise sharply from the agricultural zones. Seasonal streams cut through the terrain. Such environments can shape cultural beliefs as strongly as they shape practical life. Mountains may become landmarks, sources of water, territorial boundaries, or sacred places. It would be tempting to assume that every prominent mountain held a religious role for the Quilmes. But archaeology must be more cautious. Physical proximity does not prove religious significance. Still, the broader Andean world demonstrates that landscape often played a major role in indigenous cosmologies. Mountains, springs, caves, and unusual rock formations could possess cultural meaning. Could similar beliefs have influenced Quilmes? It is plausible, but the exact traditions of the people who lived here before European conquest cannot simply be reconstructed from later Andean beliefs. That distinction matters. Much of what we know about indigenous cultures was recorded after European contact, often through outsiders whose perspectives were incomplete. The archaeological record can sometimes correct or complicate those written accounts. At Quilmes, the stones become an independent source of evidence. They show how people actually organized space. They reveal agricultural investment. They preserve traces of construction and occupation, and they demonstrate that the community possessed the ability to transform a difficult environment into a sustainable homeland. The irrigation system is especially important. Water had to be directed from available sources toward cultivated areas. This required knowledge of slope, flow, timing, and maintenance. A damaged channel could affect crops. A blocked irrigation route could reduce harvests. The agricultural system therefore depended upon cooperation. Someone had to maintain it. Someone had to regulate access. Someone had to decide how water was distributed. This raises a deeper question about social organization. Did water management create stronger political authority?